Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was the kind of morning that starts like any other. The kind of morning where the sky is still that deep, bruised purple, caught somewhere between night and day, and the whole world feels like it is holding its breath. The air in South Florida in early winter carries something strange with it. It is not quite cold, not quite warm, just unsettled, like the weather itself cannot decide what it wants to be. The sawgrass along the edges of the Everglades whispered in the breeze, and the only sound was the low hum of a truck engine making its way down a stretch of road that most people in Miami would never have reason to drive. The man behind the wheel was a utility worker. He had been doing this job for years, driving the same lonely stretches of road before the city woke up, checking power lines and infrastructure before the Florida heat climbed high enough to make the work unbearable. He knew these roads the way most people know the inside of their own home. Every bend, every pothole, every clump of tall grass growing too close to the shoulder. He knew what belonged here and what did not. And on this particular morning in 2005, something did not belong. He almost drove past it. Almost. It was tucked just far enough off the road that a less observant person would have seen nothing more than a shape, a shadow, something the eye dismisses before the brain can catch up. But he slowed down. Something made him slow down. He pulled the truck off the road and stepped out into the cool morning air, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman was lying face down in the tall grass at the edge of the road. She was naked, completely naked. Her skin was pale against the dark earth beneath her, and she was completely still. The kind of stillness that makes the stomach drop, because it does not look like sleep. It does not look like rest. It looks like something far more final than either of those things. He ran to her. He later told investigators that he was certain she was dead, that he had already begun to prepare himself for what he was about to find. He crouched down beside her, reached out a trembling hand, and touched her shoulder. She moved, just barely. Just the smallest, most fragile shift in her body. But she was alive. She was alive, and she was breathing, and she was in tremendous pain, and right there on the side of a desolate road at the edge of the Florida Everglades, a power company worker became the only reason a 21-year-old woman did not die alone in the grass. He called 911. He stayed on the phone, crouched beside her, talking to the dispatcher, talking to the woman, trying to keep her present, trying to keep her tethered to the world, while everything inside him was screaming at the horror of what he was witnessing. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Paramedics swarmed the scene, their movements quick and practiced, their faces giving nothing away even as they assessed the severity of what had been done to this woman. And what had been done to her was devastating. She was airlifted to Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, one of the finest trauma centers in the country. The doctors who received her were experienced. They had seen violence in many forms, but even they were struck by the brutality of her injuries. She had severe head trauma. The bones around her eye socket had been shattered. Her face was so badly swollen that it was nearly unrecognizable as human. There was evidence of sexual assault. There were injuries that spoke of a prolonged and savage attack, not a moment of rage, but something sustained and deliberate and vicious. She was rushed into surgery. The medical team worked to stabilize her, to repair what could be repaired, to stop the bleeding and quiet the swelling in her brain. For hours, no one knew if she would survive the night. She did. She survived. And when she finally opened her eyes in that hospital room, the detectives who had been waiting outside got the signal they had been hoping for. They straightened their jackets and walked toward the door, ready to begin gathering whatever information this young woman could give them. They needed to know her name. They needed to know what had happened to her. They needed a description, a location, anything that could point them toward whoever had done this to her. But the first words out of her mouth were not directed at them. She did not ask for the police. She did not ask for her family. She did not ask where she was, or what had happened, or whether she was safe. The first thing she asked for, with broken English and a voice rough from pain and trauma, was a lawyer. A lawyer. Not a mother. Not a friend. Not even a nurse. A lawyer. The detectives exchanged a look across the hospital corridor. It was a small moment, barely visible to anyone watching, but it carried enormous weight. Because in all their years of working these cases, a victim in this condition asking for a lawyer instead of their loved ones was not just unusual. It was almost unheard of. And it raised a question that would follow this investigation like a shadow for months. Who was this woman, really? And why, lying broken and barely alive in a hospital bed, did her first instinct tell her to protect herself legally rather than reach out for comfort? The detectives did not have answers yet, but the questions were already multiplying faster than they could count. Her name, they eventually learned, was Anastasia. She was 21 years old, originally from Ukraine, and she had been working for a major cruise line company that operated out of Miami. It was not a glamorous life, working on a cruise ship. Long hours, shared quarters, service jobs that kept her on her feet from early morning until late at night. But it was a way to build something, to earn money and send some of it home and perhaps, eventually, carve out a better life than what she had left behind in Eastern Europe. She had been injured on the job. A hand injury, not serious enough to require hospitalization, but serious enough to ground her from active duty while it healed. Her employer had arranged for her to stay at the Airport Regency Hotel in Miami while she recovered. It was a modest hotel, the kind of place that caters to airline crews and business travelers passing through. Not flashy, not 5 stars, but functional and close to the airport and safe. Or at least it was supposed to be safe. The detectives listened to her carefully as she began to speak. Her memory was fragmented. She told them that she had been in her room, that she remembered men, more than one, possibly 2 or 3 of them. She thought they might have been white. She thought she heard accents, possibly Hispanic, possibly something Eastern European. She remembered being forced to drink alcohol. She remembered a pillow pressed against her face, cutting off her air. She remembered being lifted, being carried, the sensation of movement. And then she remembered the grass, the cold ground, the feeling of being left somewhere dark and alone. It was deeply harrowing testimony, even filtered through a translator, even fragmented and uncertain. It painted a picture of something horrific. Detectives took notes. They asked careful questions, trying to piece together a coherent timeline without pressuring her too hard while she was still in recovery. But something kept snagging on the edges of the investigation. Her story changed, not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily dismissed as the confusion of trauma, but in ways that were difficult to ignore. The number of attackers shifted. 3, she said one day. Then 1, she said another. The accents changed. Hispanic at first, then possibly Romanian. The sequence of events shuffled and rearranged itself from one conversation to the next. Investigators had encountered this before. Trauma does terrible things to memory. The brain under extreme stress does not record events the way a camera records them. It fragments and compresses and sometimes fills the gaps with guesses that feel like facts. The detectives understood this. They made allowances for it. But then something happened that made the allowances harder to sustain. A lawsuit was filed. Shortly after Anastasia began her recovery, her lawyer filed a civil lawsuit against the Airport Regency Hotel. The lawsuit alleged that the hotel had failed in its duty to protect a guest from being abducted and assaulted on its premises. It was a significant claim, and it had significant financial implications. Hotels have insurance. Hotels have deep pockets. A successful lawsuit in a case like this could result in a very large settlement. The detectives were not naive. They had seen this before too, the intersection of criminal investigation and civil litigation, the way it could muddy the waters of truth. They were not saying Anastasia was lying. They were not saying her injuries were not real, because they absolutely were real, devastatingly and undeniably real. But the lawsuit introduced a layer of complexity that made the investigation harder to navigate. And the investigation was already struggling. Because the hotel's security footage, the very footage that should have answered every question about what had happened that night, was telling them almost nothing. They reviewed every camera. They checked every angle. They went through hours and hours of footage covering the entrance, the lobby, the elevators, the stairwells, the parking lot, the perimeter. They cross-referenced keycard access logs with the camera footage. They interviewed hotel staff, night managers, security guards, cleaning crews, front desk workers. And what they found was a mystery so clean and so complete that it almost defied explanation. There was footage of Anastasia entering the hotel in the early hours of the morning. There was footage of her taking the elevator to the 4th floor. There were keycard records showing her room door opening at the expected time. She had made it to her room. She had gone to bed. And then she had simply vanished. No footage of her leaving. No footage of anyone else leaving with her. No footage of a struggle. No footage of anyone unusual in the corridor outside her room. Nothing that pointed to a method, a motive, or a suspect. 8 miles away, she had been found at the edge of the Everglades. But no camera in that hotel had captured how she got there. The lead detective on the case, a man named Alan Foote who had worked with Miami-Dade for years and had seen more than a share of difficult investigations, was methodical and experienced. He reviewed the footage himself. He went through it frame by frame. He brought in colleagues. He consulted with the hotel's own security team. Nobody could explain it. After weeks of investigation, with no suspects and no viable leads, and a victim whose testimony was inconsistent and who had already retained legal counsel in connection with a civil suit against the primary location of the alleged crime, the case began to do the thing that cases sometimes do when all other options run out. It went cold. Not officially closed. Not abandoned. But cold. Moved to a lower priority. Assigned to a pile of cases that would be revisited when new information surfaced, when a witness came forward, when technology improved, when something broke loose. The file sat. The question sat with it. And somewhere in Miami, in a hotel corridor, on a security camera, in the compressed digital memory of a hard drive that almost no one was still watching, a secret waited to be found. But not by the police. By someone else entirely. Because the hotel had been sued. And the hotel, like any business facing a significant lawsuit, had done what businesses do. They had hired someone to find the truth before it found them. They had reached out to a private investigation firm. They had asked for the best man available. And the name they were given was Ken Brennan. Ken Brennan was not the kind of man who announced himself. He did not walk into rooms making noise or wear the kind of face that invites conversation. He was a former Long Island police officer, a former DEA agent, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life working in the kind of environments where being underestimated was sometimes the most useful tool available. He was tough, but not in the performative way that some men mistake for actual toughness. He was tough the way old iron is tough, quietly, without needing to prove it, resistant to pressure and temperature and time. He took the case, and the first thing he told the hotel's lawyers, the very first thing, before he had reviewed a single document or watched a single second of footage, was this: "I'll find out what happened, but I'm not working for your version of the truth. I'm working for the actual truth, whatever that turns out to be." The lawyers were not entirely comfortable with that. Lawyers rarely are, when someone tells them their version of the truth might not be the one that survives scrutiny. But they nodded, because they needed him, and they let him begin. He called Detective Alan Foote. Foote was skeptical. Private investigators, in his experience, had a habit of complicating cases rather than solving them. They had different motivations, different loyalties, different definitions of what constituted success. They worked for clients who wanted specific outcomes, and specific outcomes had a way of shaping what evidence got emphasized and what got quietly set aside. He had seen it happen before, and he had no particular desire to see it happen again. But Brennan was different, or at least he seemed different. He came across the phone as direct, unvarnished, genuinely curious. He did not ask Foote to share anything confidential or to compromise the investigation. He simply asked to sit down, look at what they had, and think about it together. 2 sets of eyes, he said, are better than one. Foote agreed to meet, and Brennan sat down with the case file and the footage and the timeline and the inconsistencies, and he began to do the one thing that the investigation had not yet done with enough patience or enough obsession. He began to really look, and what he was about to find would change everything. Ken Brennan was the kind of man who did not believe in dead ends. He had seen too many cases in his career where an investigation had stopped moving not because the evidence ran out, but because the people looking at the evidence had stopped believing something was there. That was a failure of will, not a failure of the case itself. He had seen it so many times that he had made a private rule for himself. Before he concluded that a mystery was unsolvable, he had to be able to say with absolute certainty that he had looked at every piece of evidence until his eyes ached, and then looked again. So he started with the surveillance footage. The hotel had cameras on every floor, in every elevator, covering every exit, facing the parking lot and the perimeter. The system had recorded everything from the night in question and the hours that followed. Detectives had already reviewed it. Hotel security had already reviewed it. And everyone who had reviewed it had come to the same conclusion. There was nothing to see, nothing suspicious, nothing that explained how a young woman had been removed from a locked hotel room in the middle of the night without anyone seeing it happen. Brennan poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down in front of a monitor, and started the footage from the beginning. He watched Anastasia enter the hotel at 3:41 in the morning. She was moving carefully, favoring her injured hand, her face showing the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from laziness but from physical pain. She walked through the lobby, pressed the elevator button, and stepped inside when the doors opened. The camera inside the elevator caught her clearly. She was alone in the elevator. She pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed. The next camera angle showed her stepping off the elevator on the 4th floor, moving down the hallway toward her room. The keycard log confirmed it. Her door opened at 3:44 in the morning. She went inside, and then, as far as the cameras were concerned, Anastasia ceased to exist. Brennan watched the footage from every angle that covered a possible exit point. The stairwells, the service entrance, the parking garage, the main lobby doors. Nothing. There was no footage of Anastasia leaving the building. There was no footage of anyone carrying her or dragging her or guiding her out against her will. The cameras had recorded approximately nothing of use. Except, Brennan rewound to the elevator footage. He watched the doors open when Anastasia arrived at the lobby level. He watched her step inside. He watched the doors begin to close. And then he saw something that made him stop the footage and sit very still. There was someone else in the elevator. Not someone who had entered after her. Not someone who came running through the lobby at the last second. Someone who had already been inside the elevator when the doors opened. Someone who had been riding it down, or waiting, or simply standing there in the narrow silver box when the doors parted and a young Ukrainian woman with an injured hand and tired eyes stepped inside. He was massive. That was the first thing Brennan noted, and it was impossible to overlook because the man's physical presence dominated the frame even on a low-resolution security camera. He was enormous in the way that very few people are truly enormous, the kind of size that stops a room when a person walks into it, that changes the geography of any space simply by being present in it. Brennan estimated later that the man was somewhere around 6 feet 4 inches tall and in the vicinity of 300 pounds. He wore glasses, which Brennan noted carefully because glasses are a detail that some people overlook, but that distinguish a face more reliably than most people realize. The man rode the elevator up with Anastasia. The footage captured both of them in the car together. And then the doors opened on the 4th floor, and both of them stepped out. Brennan watched the hallway footage. He watched Anastasia move toward her room. He watched the large man move in a different direction, presumably toward his own room. The hallway camera did not capture everything with perfect clarity, but the motion was there. And then Brennan did something that no one else had thought to do with enough precision. He tracked the large man through every camera in the hotel for the next 2 hours. At 5:28 in the morning, the same man appeared again on the elevator camera. But this time, something was different. This time, he was not alone. He was pulling a rolling suitcase behind him. A large one, the kind that travelers use for extended trips, the kind that is designed to hold a substantial amount of clothing and personal items and whatever else a person needs when they are going to be away from home for a while. The man pulled the suitcase out of the elevator and moved through the lobby. Brennan watched him exit the hotel through the main doors. The parking lot camera caught him moving through the lot, still pulling the suitcase, until he moved beyond the range of the camera and disappeared from view. Brennan did not move from his seat. He kept watching. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, the same man walked back through the main entrance of the hotel. He moved through the lobby. He took the elevator. He returned to wherever he had been going. Without the suitcase, Brennan rewound the footage again. He watched the man exit with the suitcase. He watched him return without it. He did the math in his head. It was 5:28 in the morning when the man left with the suitcase. Not 9 a.m., not noon, not any reasonable hour when a person checks out of a hotel and loads their luggage into a car. 5:28 in the morning, before the sun was up, before the city was awake, before anyone was likely to be watching. And there was the other thing, the suitcase wheels. Brennan leaned close to the screen. The image quality was not perfect. It never was in these older hotel security systems, but it was good enough. As the man pulled the suitcase off the elevator and began to move across the lobby floor, the wheels of the suitcase caught briefly in the gap at the edge of the elevator threshold. Just for a moment. Just long enough to require the man to yank the suitcase forward with real force, the kind of force that is not necessary to move an empty or lightly packed bag. The suitcase was heavy. Unusually, strikingly, significantly heavy. Brennan sat back in his chair. He had been doing this work for a long time. He had followed evidence through dark places and complicated logic, and the kind of reasoning that most people would rather not commit to because it leads somewhere genuinely terrible. And sitting in that room, watching that footage, he committed to it fully. He believed the woman was in that suitcase. Not luggage, not clothing, not personal items packed for an early checkout. Anastasia. He believed she had been forced or rendered unconscious and loaded into that rolling suitcase and wheeled through the lobby of the Airport Regency Hotel at 5:28 in the morning, past the security cameras and the sleeping guards and the empty front desk, and taken out to a vehicle and driven 8 miles to the edge of the Everglades and dumped in the grass and left for dead. He believed one man had done this. Not multiple attackers, not a group with accents. One man, working alone, enormous in size, capable of moving a grown woman's body in ways that required tremendous physical strength. The theory was so dark that it was almost difficult to hold in the mind. And when Brennan brought it to the hotel's lawyers and laid it out for them, stepping through the footage, walking them through the timeline, pointing to every detail that supported the conclusion he had reached, the room did not respond the way he expected. They laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, but with the kind of nervous, disbelieving laughter that people resort to when confronted with an idea so disturbing that they cannot immediately process it. They pointed out the obvious problems. Anastasia herself had described multiple attackers. She had described men with accents. She had said nothing, not one word, about a suitcase. There was no physical evidence of her being transported in such a way. The theory required a series of events so audacious, so brazen, so recklessly visible that it seemed almost impossible that a perpetrator would have attempted it. One man, walking a suitcase through a hotel lobby, with a woman inside. The lawyers shook their heads. Brennan did not shake his. He said nothing for a moment. He let the silence settle. And then he said something that would stay with everyone in that room for a long time. She doesn't remember clearly what happened because her memory was destroyed by what was done to her. What she remembers is fragments and impressions. None of that contradicts what I'm showing you in this footage. This man was in the elevator with her. 2 hours later, he left with a suitcase too heavy to roll easily. He came back without it, and she ended up 8 miles away in a field. You tell me a better explanation. Nobody offered one. But saying the theory out loud and proving it were two very different things. Brennan understood that. He needed more than a suitcase while catching on an elevator threshold. He needed to know who this man was. And he had no name. No room number, no identification, just a large man in glasses, captured on a grainy hotel security camera in the middle of the night, going about his business as though he had every right to be there. Which, for all Brennan knew at that moment, he did. He was a guest. He had a room. He had presumably checked in under his own name, paid for his stay, and moved through the hotel without triggering any alarm because there was no alarm to trigger. He was just a big man with a rolling suitcase. Brennan went back to the footage. If this man had done what Brennan believed he had done, he was not an amateur. The level of coldness required to execute something like this, to carry out a violent assault, to load a human being into a piece of luggage, to roll that luggage through a public space where anyone might see it, and then to drive miles away and discard the person like they were nothing, that required a particular kind of person. Not a person acting out of passion, not a person who had snapped in a moment of rage. A predator, experienced, calculating, accustomed to operating without being caught, which meant this might not be the first time. That thought followed Brennan out of the room and into the rest of the investigation like a cold draft moving through a hallway. If this was not the first time, then somewhere there were other victims. Other cases, other files in other cities sitting in other piles, waiting for someone with enough patience to connect the dots. He needed to find this man. He went back to the footage with renewed focus, this time looking not just at the moments when the suspect was clearly visible, but at every frame that showed any part of him. The way he moved, the way he dressed, the things he carried, The places he went in the hotel, the hours he kept. Every detail was a potential thread. And somewhere in those threads, Brennan believed, was the key to a name. He found something that nobody had noticed. In one of the earlier segments of footage, before the night of the attack, the suspect could be seen walking through the hotel lobby with another man. A companion, or at least an acquaintance. Someone he moved alongside with the comfortable ease of a person who has spent time in someone else's company. And this companion, this other man, was wearing a t-shirt. The image quality made it difficult to read clearly. Brennan played it over and over, enhancing what he could, adjusting the contrast, freezing frames until he had squeezed every pixel for whatever information it held. There was a word on the shirt. A name. Mercury. Brennan stared at it. Mercury. Just a word on a shirt. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing. Most people who were looking at this footage would have written it off immediately. A t-shirt brand. A random word. Background noise in a frame full of information that might or might not matter. But Brennan did not write it off. Because he had been doing this long enough to know that most of the time, the clue that breaks a case open is the one that everyone else decided was nothing. He kept looking at the shirt, and on another frame, in another angle, he caught one more word. Verdue. Mercury. Verdue. He pulled up a search engine and typed it in. And the answer that came back changed the entire direction of the investigation. Brennan stared at the search results on his screen. Verdue. It was not a brand name. It was not a clothing company or a chain of restaurants or a sports team from somewhere he had never heard of. Verdue was the name of a boat engine. A specific, high-performance boat engine manufactured by Mercury Marine, one of the largest and most recognized names in the marine industry. It was a premium product, the kind of thing that serious boat enthusiasts knew about, the kind of name that appeared on merchandise given to dealers and distributors and staff at major industry events. Brennan leaned back in his chair and thought about that for a moment. Mercury Marine, boat engines, merchandise, staff at industry events. And then something clicked. Miami had hosted a major boat show around the time of the attack. Brennan was not a boating man himself, but he knew enough about the city and its calendar to know that the Miami International Boat Show was one of the largest events of its kind anywhere in the world. It drew thousands of exhibitors, vendors, buyers, and industry professionals from all over the country every single year. It was the kind of event that required enormous logistical support. Food service, staffing, people working behind the scenes to keep an operation of that size running smoothly, and people working at an event like that would need somewhere to stay. They would stay at nearby hotels. Hotels like the Airport Regency. Brennan picked up the phone and called Mercury Marine directly. He explained who he was, what he was investigating, and what he needed. He needed to know if any Mercury Marine representatives had been staying at the Airport Regency Hotel during the time in question. He needed names, room numbers, any information that could help him identify the large man in glasses from the security footage. The answer was no. Mercury Marine's people had not stayed at that hotel. They were accommodated elsewhere, in properties closer to the convention center, in arrangements made through the company's corporate travel department. Nobody from Mercury Marine Corporate had been at the Airport Regency. It was a dead end, or it appeared to be a dead end. But Brennan had spent enough time investigating to know that when a door closes, you do not stare at the door. You look at the wall beside it and see if there is another way through. So he thought about it differently. The man in the hotel was wearing a Verdue shirt, a Mercury Marine product shirt. He was not a Mercury Marine corporate employee, but he was connected to the industry somehow, connected to the event, or to the products, or to the people who were there. There was a relationship of some kind. Brennan thought about what other kinds of people work at events like the Miami Boat Show. Not just the exhibitors, not just the corporate representatives and the salespeople and the marketing teams. There are other workers at events of that scale. People who run the concession stands, the food stalls, the catering operations that feed tens of thousands of visitors over the course of several days. These are not glamorous jobs. They are not jobs that come with expense accounts and corporate hotel rooms. They are jobs for people who move from city to city, event to event, working for large food service companies that contract with venues across the country. The contractor, the food service company. Brennan started making calls. He contacted the Miami Beach Convention Center, which was the primary venue for the boat show. He asked who had provided food service operations for the event that year. After several phone calls and a considerable amount of persistence, he got a name. A company called Centerplate. one of the largest food service contractors in the country, a company that staffed major events from sports stadiums to convention centers to entertainment venues all across North America. Brennan called Centerplate. This was a different kind of conversation. He was not calling a sleek corporate communications department. He was trying to reach the operational level, the people who actually hired the workers, who processed the applications, who assigned staff to specific events in specific cities. This required patience. It required navigating layers of phone trees and administrative staff and the bureaucratic instinct of large companies to protect themselves from outside inquiries. But Brennan kept going. He eventually reached someone who had been involved in staffing for the Miami Boat Show. He described what he was looking for. A large man, he said. Very large, probably around 6 feet 4 and 300 pounds. Wore glasses. Would have been working food service at the event. Did they have anyone who fit that description? The person on the other end of the line paused. And then they said something that made Brennan's pulse quicken, just slightly, just enough to register. Yeah, they said, there was a guy like that. A big guy with glasses. People remembered him because you do not forget someone that size. Quiet, they said. Seemed friendly enough. Did his job and kept to himself mostly. They gave Brennan a name. Mike Jones. Just like that. A name dropped into the air between them as casually as a weather report. Mike Jones. 2 words. The most common kind of American name imaginable. The kind of name that belongs to approximately 10,000 different men in any given city on any given day. But attached to a physical description that matched the man in the security footage, combined with a confirmed connection to the boat show and the hotel, it was suddenly the most important name Brennan had heard in months. He thanked the person he was speaking with and hung up. Then he sat very still for a moment and thought about what came next. Because having a name is not the same as having a suspect. Having a name means you have somewhere to look. And looking is the thing that comes next, the slow, careful, methodical process of verifying and locating and building enough of a picture that the name becomes a person and the person becomes someone who can be confronted with what they may have done. Brennan called Detective Foote. He had been keeping Foote informed throughout his investigation, not because he was required to, but because he understood that the best chance of this case resulting in any kind of justice lay in cooperation between his private investigation and the official police inquiry. Foote listened carefully. He asked the right questions. He pushed back where the evidence felt thin, which Brennan appreciated, because a good investigation requires someone willing to challenge every assumption. When Brennan got to the name, Foote went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me see what I can find." What they found, as they began to pull on the thread of Mike Jones, was that the thread was longer and more tangled than either of them had anticipated. Because Mike Jones did not have a fixed address. He did not have a conventional life with a house in a suburb and a regular job and a commute and a wife who would answer the door if someone came knocking. He had the kind of life that made him difficult to locate, the kind of life built for someone who needed, consciously or not, to be hard to find. He moved from city to city. He worked for food service companies that contracted with stadiums and arenas and convention centers. He followed the events. When there was work in one city, he went to that city. When the work dried up, he went somewhere else. He lived in temporary accommodations, worked temporary assignments, and left minimal traces in the places he passed through. It was, Brennan reflected, an extraordinarily effective way to live for someone who had things to hide. The trail ran cold more than once. They found records suggesting he had worked in New Orleans around the time of Hurricane Katrina, when the city had been devastated and records had been disrupted and people had scattered to every corner of the country, making it genuinely difficult to track individual movements. They followed leads that evaporated before they could be confirmed. They chased down employers who no longer had the records they needed or who had restructured through layoffs and closures that came in the wake of the storm's economic devastation. For a period of weeks, Mike Jones might as well have been a ghost. And then a name came up. Zephyr Field. It was a minor league baseball stadium in the New Orleans area, and it had at some point employed Jones in its food service operation. When investigators made contact with the stadium, they learned that Jones no longer worked there, that he had moved on to somewhere else. But he had worked there, and that confirmed he had been in the New Orleans area, which mattered for reasons that were just beginning to come into focus at the edges of the investigation. Brennan started calling companies similar to Centerplate, sports venue food service contractors. Companies that operated across multiple states, that hired large numbers of temporary workers for specific events and seasons, that might have taken on an employee matching the physical description of Mike Jones after he left the New Orleans area. He made call after call. Most of them went nowhere. Some of them produced useful fragments. And then he reached a company that did something very specific, something that Brennan had not experienced in any of the other calls. They refused to answer. Not rudely, not with hostility, but with the particular kind of careful, lawyerly non-response that large organizations adopt when they have been advised not to say anything about a particular person or matter. The person Brennan spoke with was pleasant and professional and completely, utterly uninformative. "We are not in a position to discuss individual employees," they said. "Our policy does not allow us to confirm or deny. We encourage you to submit your inquiry in writing to our legal department." Brennan thanked them and hung up. And then he sat with that refusal for a long moment. Because here was the thing about that kind of refusal. It told him something. Not about where Mike Jones was, or what he had done, or whether he was guilty of anything. But it told Brennan that something significant had been said or done or noticed in connection with this company and this person. Companies that have nothing to worry about do not lawyer up around a single inquiry about a former employee's whereabouts. That kind of defensive posture takes energy and generates risk and costs money. You only adopt it when you believe the alternative is worse. Brennan pursued a subpoena. It was not a fast process. Legal processes rarely are. There were forms to file and arguments to make and delays built into the system at every level. But eventually the subpoena was served, and the company was compelled to cooperate, and the information that came back confirmed it. Michael Lee Jones. That was his full name. Michael Lee Jones. And he was currently working at a baseball stadium in Frederick, Maryland. Brennan called Foote immediately. Foote was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. Then he said, "We need to go there." And that conversation, that decision, that agreement between a former DEA agent turned private investigator and a Miami-Dade detective who had been working this case for months, set in motion everything that came next. Because Michael Lee Jones was about to have visitors. What neither Brennan nor Foote knew yet, as they prepared to make that trip, was that the man they were going to find standing behind a counter at a baseball stadium was not going to be what either of them expected. He was not going to be agitated or defensive or obviously dangerous. He was not going to run. He was not going to make a scene. He was going to stand there, this enormous, soft-spoken, apparently friendly man, and he was going to look at the detectives and the investigator who had traveled hundreds of miles to find him, and he was going to be perfectly, completely, disarmingly calm. And that calmness was going to be its own kind of terrifying, because Brennan had learned long ago that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one who makes you forget to be afraid. What happened when they arrived would test everything Brennan believed he knew about this case. It would test Foote's certainty. It would push the investigation to its most critical and fragile moment. And the outcome would hinge on something that could not be argued with, could not be charmed away, could not be deflected by a pleasant demeanor or a cooperative attitude. It would hinge on science. And the science was already waiting. The drive to Frederick, Maryland felt longer than it was. Foote had made arrangements for the trip, coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure they had the necessary jurisdiction and backup if things went sideways. These situations could go wrong in 100 different ways. A suspect who ran. A suspect who turned violent. A suspect who lawyered up so fast that any chance of useful conversation evaporated before it could begin. They planned for all of it. What they could not plan for was the man himself. Frederick, Maryland is a mid-sized city in the western part of the state, about an hour northwest of Baltimore. It has the look and feel of a place that has been quietly going about its business for a long time. A city with Revolutionary War history and Civil War history and a downtown that feels lived in rather than polished. The baseball stadium sat on the edge of the city, a modest minor league facility that hosted the local team through the warm months. The kind of place where the concessions are simple and the crowds are local and life operates at a comfortable, uncomplicated pace. They found Jones working the food service counter. He was exactly what the footage had suggested. Enormous. The kind of big that makes rooms feel smaller. He stood behind the counter with the easy competence of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time, moving with a fluid efficiency that seemed almost incongruous given his size. He wore glasses. He looked up when the men approached. And he smiled. Not the startled, caught off guard smile of someone who was not expecting to be found. Not the rigid, forced smile of someone constructing a performance. A genuine, open, warm smile. The kind that goes all the way to the eyes. The kind that makes people like you immediately and instinctively before they have had a chance to think about why. He said hello. He was cooperative from the first moment. He agreed to speak with them. He stepped away from the counter, found a quiet area, sat down with them, and listened as they explained who they were and what they wanted to discuss. And when they told him why they were there, when they mentioned the Airport Regency Hotel and the date and the woman who had been found near the Everglades, he did not flinch. He did not pale or look away or begin the kinds of micro-gestures that trained investigators look for when a person is being deceptive. He sat with it for a moment, as though genuinely thinking, and then he shook his head slowly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a man who did not feel the need to raise it, who understood that presence could do the work that volume could not. He said the words without aggression, without the brittle defensiveness of someone constructing a lie in real time. He said them the way you might say them if you actually did not know what someone was talking about. He denied it completely. He acknowledged being in Miami during the period in question. He acknowledged staying at the Airport Regency Hotel. He did not try to pretend that his presence there was not real, because he understood that they already knew it was real, and denying verifiable facts would only make things worse. But the woman, the attack, the suitcase, all of it, he said, he had no knowledge of any of it. He said, completely willing to help them figure out what had happened. He would answer any questions they had. He would cooperate in every way possible. And then he said something that surprised both of them. He said he would provide a DNA sample, voluntarily, right there, right then, without a lawyer present, and without being compelled by a court order. He seemed almost eager to do it, the way a man with nothing to hide might be eager to demonstrate exactly that. He signed the consent form without reading it slowly or looking for loopholes. He opened his mouth for the swab without hesitation. Foote watched all of this with the practiced neutrality of an experienced detective. He noted everything. The calmness, the cooperation, the voluntary DNA. And when they walked away from the stadium and got back into the car, he said what he was thinking. "I don't think he did it." Brennan sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for a moment. He stared out the windshield at the parking lot of the stadium, at the ordinary afternoon light falling on asphalt and chain-link fencing and a food truck parked near the entrance. He thought about the footage. He thought about the suitcase wheels catching on the elevator threshold. He thought about the weight of what was inside. "Let's wait for the DNA," he said. Foote nodded. It was the only answer that made sense. Whatever either of them felt about the man they had just spoken with, whatever impression Jones had made in that quiet conversation behind the concession stand, the DNA would tell a story that could not be performed or managed or shaped by charm and a cooperative attitude. The sample went to the lab, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting is the part of an investigation that nobody talks about enough. The work is glamorous in retrospect. The discovery of a clue, the flash of insight, the decision to go to Frederick, Maryland and find the man behind the counter. These things make sense in the telling, but the waiting is different. The waiting is sitting with an open question that you cannot force closed, knowing that somewhere in a laboratory, in a series of chemical processes that you cannot observe or influence, a machine is moving toward a verdict that will either validate everything you believe or collapse it entirely. Brennan had been through this before. He knew how to wait, but this one felt different. This one felt like it mattered in a way that went beyond the immediate case, beyond Anastasia's lawsuit and the hotel's liability and the question of what had happened in that room on that particular night. There was something about Michael Lee Jones, about the pattern of his life, about the way he moved from city to city and event to event and left almost no trace, that made Brennan feel like they were not looking at one crime. They were looking at a career. The weeks passed, and then the call came. Foote received it first. He called Brennan immediately after, and when Brennan answered the phone, he could tell from the first syllable what the answer was. There is a particular quality to a person's voice when they have just received confirmation of something they hoped for and dreaded simultaneously, something that changes the air in the moment of contact. The DNA was a perfect match. Michael Lee Jones's DNA matched the evidence recovered from Anastasia. Not a close match, Not a probable match, not the kind of statistical probability that defense attorneys can pick at in a courtroom. A perfect match, the kind that removes doubt at the molecular level, the kind that means what you think it means. Jones was arrested. When they came for him this time, he was not standing behind a concession counter in Frederick, Maryland. The arrest happened after the DNA results were confirmed and the paperwork was in order, and law enforcement had done everything necessary to ensure that what happened next would hold up in court. He was taken into custody without incident, because Michael Lee Jones was not the kind of man who ran or fought when cornered. He remained, even in the moment of his arrest, that same unnerving combination of large and calm and seemingly reasonable. He continued to deny it. He told investigators that whatever encounter he had had with Anastasia was consensual. He told them she had approached him. He told them things about her that were designed to reframe the narrative, to introduce doubt, to shift the story from what the DNA said it was to something more complicated and less clear-cut. He was specific and detailed in his version of events, the way people sometimes are when they have spent time constructing an alternative story. But the DNA did not care about the alternative story, and Brennan did not stop there. Because Brennan had not been idle during the weeks of waiting. He had been thinking about Michael Lee Jones and the pattern of his life and the cities he had passed through and the events he had worked. He had been thinking about the particular kind of predator who moves through the world under cover of ordinary employment, who uses the legitimacy of a job and a work uniform and a concession counter to get close to people in public spaces, to seem harmless, to blend into the background of massive, crowded events where no one person's face stands out. He shared his thinking with the investigators working the case, and they took it to the next level. Jones's DNA was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database that law enforcement uses to link evidence from unsolved crimes across jurisdictions. It is one of the most powerful investigative tools available to modern law enforcement, a system that contains genetic profiles from crime scenes all over the country, waiting to be matched against new submissions. The results came back faster than anyone expected, and when they did, the room that received them went very quiet. 3 matches, 3 separate rape cases in 3 separate jurisdictions, cases that had been sitting unsolved, cases where victims had reported an attacker and evidence had been collected and processed and filed, cases where investigators had done everything right and still could not find a name to attach to the crime. 2 of the matches were in New Orleans. 1 was in Colorado. Brennan read the summaries of those cases. He read the victim statements, or the summaries of them that were available, and something cold and heavy settled in his chest. Because the descriptions were consistent, not identical, because individual memory and individual experience produce variations in how people describe the same person, but consistent. A huge man, glasses, quiet, approachable, the kind of man who offered help, who seemed friendly, who used his apparent harmlessness as a weapon. He had been doing this for years. Not in one city, not in one state. Across the country, moving with the rhythm of major events, appearing and disappearing, leaving victims in his wake, each one in a different jurisdiction where no one had the full picture because no one had connected the pieces. Until now, the realization of the full scope of what Michael Lee Jones had been doing did not arrive with drama. It arrived the way the worst truths always arrive, quietly, with a weight that builds slowly until it is almost impossible to carry. Brennan had begun this investigation trying to solve one case, trying to answer one question about one young woman found in a field near the Everglades. He had expected to find a suspect with a connection to a hotel. He had not expected to find a predator who had been operating on a national scale for long enough to accumulate victims in multiple states. He had not expected to be sitting with the knowledge that there might be more. Not just 3, not just the ones CODIS had returned, but others. Women in other cities, in other years, who had reported something and been disbelieved, or whose cases had stalled, or who had not reported at all because they had no faith that reporting would lead anywhere. The investigation now stretched far beyond the Airport Regency Hotel and far beyond one private detective studying security footage in a room in Miami. It had become something larger and more serious, something that would require prosecutors and courts and the kind of patient, grinding legal process that moves slowly but, when it moves correctly, produces something real. Jones was going to face justice. But before that happened, before the courts had their say, there was still one more thing that Brennan needed to understand. one more thread to pull. Because he was not just a man who solved cases. He was a man who needed to understand them, who needed to trace the story all the way to its source, who could not let go of a question until it had an answer. The question that stayed with him was the one about Anastasia, her changing story, her request for a lawyer, her lawsuit against the hotel. He had never been entirely comfortable with the complexity of her position in this case. She was unquestionably a victim. Her injuries were real. The DNA evidence was real. What had been done to her was real and brutal and devastating. But there were aspects of the way this had all unfolded that he had never fully resolved in his mind. And as the legal case against Jones began to take shape, some of those aspects would come more fully into view. But that was not what stayed with Brennan most deeply as he processed what they had found. What stayed with him was the suitcase wheel. That tiny, ordinary moment. A wheel catching on a threshold. A man tugging a bag. A detail so small that it had passed unnoticed by everyone who had looked at that footage before him. And in that small moment, hidden inside what looked like nothing, the entire truth of what had happened to a young woman on a winter night in Miami. He thought about all the things in the world that looked like nothing, and he wondered how many of them were not. There is a particular kind of darkness that settles over a case when you realize the crime you have been investigating is not a single event. It is not one terrible night with one victim and one perpetrator and one location. It is a pattern. It is a history. It is something that has been happening quietly and systematically for long enough that the damage it has caused reaches across time and geography in ways that are almost impossible to fully measure. Brennan had worked major cases before. He had investigated violence in forms that most people never encounter, working first as a cop on Long Island, then as a DEA agent in the complex and dangerous world of drug enforcement, and now as a private investigator who was called in specifically for the cases that seemed impossible. He had developed a kind of armor over the years, the professional detachment that is not coldness, but is something adjacent to it, the ability to look at horrifying things without being destroyed by them. But the Cody's results unsettled him in a way he had not anticipated. 3 cases, 2 in New Orleans, 1 in Colorado. He sat with those files and thought about the women whose names were attached to them. He thought about what it meant to have reported an assault and had the case go nowhere. Not because investigators were incompetent or indifferent, but because the system had no way to connect what had happened to you with what had happened to someone 1,000 miles away, because the man who hurt you had moved on before anyone knew to look for him, because the mobility of his life was itself a form of protection. He thought about how many more there might be. The Cody's database, vast and comprehensive as it is, only contains what has been entered into it. It only knows about cases where DNA evidence was collected and processed and submitted. It only knows about victims who reported. And Brennan knew, from years of working in the margins of violence and crime and the systems designed to address them, that reporting is not universal. That victims of sexual assault report at rates that are deeply, troublingly low. That for every case in the database, there are others that never made it there. He did not voice this calculation often, because it was the kind of math that could break something in a person if they let it. But he held it privately, like a weight. Detective Foote, for his part, was moving through the procedural landscape of building a prosecution. Jones was in custody. The DNA evidence was unambiguous. The Cody's matches provided both additional evidence of pattern behavior and additional charges that could potentially be brought in multiple jurisdictions. The machinery of the legal system had engaged, and it was doing what it was designed to do, slowly, carefully, grinding toward an outcome. Foote had been wrong about Jones when they had met him in Frederick. He had read the man's calmness and cooperation as innocence, or at least as the absence of the guilt he was looking for. It was a miscalculation he acknowledged privately, though not with the excessive self-criticism that some investigators fall into when they get something wrong. Getting it wrong was part of the job. What mattered was getting it right in the end. Jones had been extraordinarily good at presenting himself. That was the thing that stayed with Foote. The DNA had matched, the evidence was overwhelming, and yet the man he had sat across from in that stadium had seemed so completely unalarming that Foote had walked away believing in his innocence. There was a lesson in that, one he carried forward. The most convincing liars are not the ones who work hardest at deception. They are the ones who have internalized it so completely that it comes out of them like truth. As the legal process moved forward, the details of Jones's life began to emerge more fully. Investigators in multiple states coordinated to build as complete a picture as possible of his movements and activities over the years. What they found confirmed what Brennan had suspected. Jones had been living the kind of life that made him nearly invisible. He moved from assignment to assignment with the food service companies, living in motels and temporary housing, working the stadiums and the convention centers and the arenas, earning enough to sustain the movement without establishing the kind of roots that leave a trail. He was not a complicated man in the conventional sense. He was not a criminal mastermind who had designed his lifestyle as a cover. He was simply a man who lived the way he lived, and that way of living happened to make it very difficult for anyone to find him or connect his various acts to each other. The mobility that might have seemed like poverty of ambition or rootlessness to an outside observer had, functionally, served as a kind of camouflage. The victims in New Orleans were interviewed again. Their cases, which had sat cold for years, were reopened in light of the DNA match. The details they provided were chilling in their consistency with what had happened to Anastasia. The same physical description, the same manner of approach, friendly, non-threatening. The enormous size somehow made less alarming by the gentleness of his demeanor. The same sudden, catastrophic violence. The Colorado victim's account followed a similar pattern. She had encountered Jones at or near a venue where he was working. He had been approachable. He had seemed safe. And then everything had gone wrong in ways that had taken her years to begin to process. These were women who had survived, who had reported, whose cases were now, finally, connected to a name and a face and a man sitting in a detention facility, waiting to see what the legal system was going to do with him. There was something that approached relief in that, the knowledge that the waiting was over, that the mystery of who had done this to them had been resolved. But relief is complicated when it arrives years late, when it comes alongside the knowledge that the man who hurt you had gone on to hurt others in the time between his crime against you and his eventual capture. Brennan followed all of this from a distance. His role had been the investigative phase, the part that happened before the arrest, before the charges, before the courtrooms and the lawyers and the long, exhausting procedural grind of a criminal trial. He had found the man. He had built the theory. He had pushed the case forward when everyone else was ready to let it go cold. The rest of it was Foot's work now, and the prosecutor's work, and eventually the jury's work. But he stayed connected to the case in the informal way that investigators sometimes do when something has gotten under their skin. He talked to Foot periodically. He read what he could find in the public record. He waited. Jones maintained his denial throughout the pretrial period. He had by now retained legal counsel, and his lawyers were doing what defense attorneys do, examining the evidence, looking for procedural weaknesses, building arguments that could create reasonable doubt where the prosecution was trying to establish certainty. They challenged the circumstances under which the DNA sample had been collected. They questioned the chain of custody of evidence. They pressed on the inconsistencies in Anastasia's testimony, on the changing details, on the lawsuit she had filed, on the question of whether her account of events could be trusted given how much it had shifted. These were legitimate legal arguments. The adversarial system of justice is designed to test evidence in exactly this way, to ensure that convictions are not obtained through weak or manipulated evidence, to protect the rights of the accused even when the evidence against them seems overwhelming. Brennan understood this. He did not resent it, but he watched it carefully, because he knew that there is a difference between testing evidence and distorting it, and he wanted to see which way Jones's defense would push. While the legal machinery turned, something else was happening that would ultimately prove decisive. The Colorado case moved first. There are practical reasons why prosecutors sometimes choose to try a defendant in a particular jurisdiction first. Strength of evidence, severity of charges, willingness of victims to testify, the specific legal statutes available in a given state. Prosecutors in Colorado looked at what they had, the DNA match, the victim's testimony, the pattern evidence from the other cases, and they decided they had what they needed. The trial was not short. These things never are when the stakes are this high. There were opening arguments and motions and witness examinations and cross-examinations and a slow, methodical presentation of evidence that is the reality of a serious criminal prosecution as opposed to the television version. The victim testified. It was difficult. The way this kind of testimony is always difficult, requiring a person to revisit the worst thing that happened to them in a public room in front of strangers, to submit to questioning that is designed, procedurally, to challenge what they say they know. She did it. And the DNA did what DNA does in a courtroom when it is presented correctly and supported by other evidence. It spoke with a clarity that cannot be argued around, only argued about, and the jury listened to the arguments and the evidence and came to a conclusion. Michael Lee Jones was found guilty. The sentence handed down was severe. Decades in prison, a term that for a man of Jones's age amounted effectively to the rest of his life. He would, barring extraordinary circumstances, die in custody. The freedom to move from city to city, to take the next assignment, to appear in the next venue and do the next horrible thing, was gone. Foote called Brennan when the verdict came in. Brennan was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said something that Foote would later remember for a long time. "Good," he said. Just that one word. Not celebration, not triumph. Just a quiet, heavy, final acknowledgement that something necessary had been achieved. But even in that moment, Brennan could not fully let himself rest in it. Because the thing about having found a serial predator, about having traced a pattern across states and years and victims, is that finding an ending for the legal case does not mean you have found an ending for the damage. It does not account for the cases that were never reported. It does not account for the women who had not had a Ken Brennan studying their surveillance footage, or a detective Foote willing to share a case file, or a DNA database that happened to hold the evidence needed to make a connection. He thought about those women. He thought about them the way you think about something you can't fix, something that is beyond the reach of what any investigation can accomplish. Because an investigation can find a man. It can build a case. It can put a predator in front of a jury and let the jury do what juries are supposed to do. But it cannot go back. It cannot undo the morning on the road near the Everglades. It cannot undo what happened in a hotel room in the middle of the night, or in New Orleans, or in Colorado, or in whatever other cities Jones had passed through in the years before anyone connected the dots. The verdict is a line drawn at the end, a marker that says this stops here. But everything that happened before the line remains. Brennan understood this. He had understood it for most of his professional life. It was the thing that made the work both urgent and, in some deep sense, always incomplete. But there was also this. One suitcase wheel. One while catching on a threshold in a hotel elevator at 5:28 in the morning in Miami, Florida. One private investigator who noticed it when everyone else had looked at the same footage and seen nothing. One chain of reasoning that ran from a wheel to a shirt to a word to a boat engine to a boat show to a food service company to a name to a man standing behind a barbecue counter in Frederick, Maryland. That chain was real, and what it had produced was real. And the women in Colorado and New Orleans whose cases were now closed, whose attacker was now behind bars, knew something that evening that they had not known for a very long time. His name, where he was, that he was never going to be able to do this again. That was not nothing. In fact, it was everything. What people do not often talk about, in the aftermath of a case like this, is the texture of the years that led to the verdict. Not the dramatic moments, not the discovery of the suitcase clue or the DNA match or the moment in the courtroom when the foreman stood up and delivered the jury's decision. Those moments are the ones that get remembered, the ones that get retold, the ones that feel in retrospect like a story with a shape and a logic and a resolution. But between those moments there is so much else. There is the grinding labor of investigation. There are the wrong turns and the dead ends and the phone calls that go nowhere. There are the nights when the person trying to solve the puzzle sits with the evidence and cannot make it cohere, when the picture that seemed almost clear an hour ago has blurred back into a set of disconnected facts that refuse to speak to each other. There are the moments of doubt, even for someone as determined as Brennan, when the reasonable voice inside says maybe this is just a man who checked out of a hotel early. Brennan had those moments. He would acknowledge them later, in conversation, with the particular kind of directness that had always been his trademark. He would say that there were times during the investigation when he looked at what he had and thought seriously about whether he was right. Not whether he wanted to be right, because wanting never really enters into it when you are trying to do this kind of work honestly, but whether the evidence actually supported the conclusion he was building. The suitcase theory was the thing he kept coming back to. It was the thing that had made the room laugh when he first presented it. It was the thing that seemed, on its face, almost absurdly theatrical, a grown woman inside a rolling suitcase, wheeled through a hotel lobby. And every time he returned to it, he had to do the same thing he did the first time, strip away the emotional reaction, and look at it purely as a question of physics and logistics. Could a person of Anastasia's build fit inside a large rolling suitcase? He had answered that question empirically. He had found a suitcase matching the dimensions visible in the security footage. He had asked a woman of comparable size and build to demonstrate whether she could fit inside it. She could, not comfortably, not in any way that would be survivable for a long period of time. But for the duration of a hotel lobby crossing and a drive of several miles, it was physically possible. Could a man of Jones's size and strength move a loaded suitcase of that weight through a hotel? Also yes, Brennan had done that math too. A woman of average weight, added to the weight of a large suitcase, produced a combined weight that would have been demanding but manageable for a man of Jones's extraordinary physical strength. The wheel catching on the elevator threshold was not evidence of struggle or obstruction. It was evidence of weight. The simple, concrete fact of a heavily loaded bag doing what heavily loaded bags do. So the theory held. But holding a theory and proving it are different things, and Brennan knew that without the DNA, without the Cody's matches, the theory would have remained exactly what it was in that conference room full of laughing lawyers. An interesting idea, a private detective's hunch, something that could not be turned into a courtroom argument without more. The DNA had been the thing that turned it into something real, and Jones's decision to provide that DNA voluntarily, without hesitation, without consulting an attorney first, was something Brennan continued to think about long after the verdict. It was either the decision of an innocent man who genuinely had nothing to hide and was confident that the evidence would bear him out, or it was the decision of someone so accustomed to his own invincibility, so practiced at presenting himself as harmless, that he had not believed the science would catch him. Brennan thought it was the latter. He thought Jones had looked at the two men sitting across from him and had made a calculation. He had calculated that the evidence, whatever these investigators thought they had, was not enough to convict him. He had calculated that volunteering the DNA would reinforce the impression of innocence and cooperation that his demeanor had already created. He had calculated that this was the smart play. He had been wrong, and there was something quietly satisfying about that to Brennan. Not gloating, not triumph over a fallen adversary, just the particular satisfaction of watching a very confident miscalculation produce exactly the outcome that the miscalculator had been trying to avoid. Jones had believed he was smarter than the science. He was not. But Brennan's thoughts in the aftermath of the verdict kept returning to something that the legal conclusion had not fully addressed. The question of the unreported cases. The question of the women who had crossed paths with Michael Lee Jones in the years of his movement across the country and had not ended up in a hospital or a police report or a DNA database. Not because nothing had happened to them, but for any number of other reasons. Fear, shame, distrust of the system, the belief that reporting would not lead anywhere, the belief that a woman's account of what a large, calm, friendly man had done to her would be received with skepticism rather than action. These were not irrational calculations. They were, in many documented instances, accurate predictions of what would happen. Brennan had worked with enough victims over the course of his career to understand the weight of this. He had seen what the process of reporting and investigating and prosecuting a violent crime cost the people who had experienced it. He understood why some chose not to pay that cost. He understood, even when he wished the number were different, that the 3 victims whose cases had been linked through Cody's probably did not represent the full count. Investigators shared this belief. The prosecutors in Colorado had said as much, carefully and professionally, noting that the scope of Jones's possible criminal activity might extend beyond what the evidence had so far revealed. They said it not to alarm anyone unnecessarily, but because it was true, and because truth has to be stated even when it is uncomfortable. There is always the possibility, in a case like this, that justice, however real and however deserved, arrives at the end of a story rather than the beginning of one. That what looks like a conclusion is actually only the visible part of something much larger, the piece above the waterline, while the greater mass remains below. This is a difficult thing to hold. And in the days after the verdict, in the conversations that Brennan had with various people who had been involved in the case, this difficulty was present. People process it differently. Some find it easier to focus on what was achieved, on the fact that a dangerous man was off the street, on the specificity of the justice delivered to the 3 victims whose cases had been solved. Others find it harder to stop looking at the shadow cast by what remains unknown. Brennan was, by temperament and training, someone who looked at shadows. He did not discuss the case publicly in the way that a person who wanted attention might. He was not seeking fame or a book deal or a television appearance, though the story eventually found its way into various media, because stories like this always do. He talked about it when asked directly, with the flat, factual precision of someone who had been trained to describe evidence rather than dramatize it. He described the footage. He described the suitcase. He described the wheel catching on the threshold. He described the mercury marine shirt on the companion. He described the phone calls and the dead ends, and the company that refused to answer, and the subpoena, and the name that eventually came out of all of it. Michael Lee Jones. He described what the DNA showed, and what Cody's revealed, and what the courts ultimately decided. And then he would usually stop. Not because there was nothing more to say. There was always more to say. But because some things are better left to sit in the mind of whoever is listening, to land with whatever weight they land with, without being pushed toward a particular emotional destination by the person doing the telling. He thought the story was its own argument. What the story argued was this: the difference between a solved case and an unsolved case is sometimes evidence. New evidence. Better technology. DNA. A witness who comes forward. Something concrete and new that changes what the investigation knows. But sometimes, the difference is not new evidence at all. Sometimes the evidence was always there, sitting on a hard drive, captured by a camera, recorded at 5:28 in the morning by a system that had been doing exactly what it was designed to do. The evidence was there, and the case remained unsolved anyway, because the person looking at the footage had not been looking in the right way, or with the right questions, or for long enough. That is the thing about surveillance footage. About any body of evidence, really. It does not reveal itself passively. It does not step forward and announce what it contains. You have to look at it. You have to look at it for a long time. You have to be willing to see things that nobody else saw, and to hold on to what you see even when the room laughs at you. Brennan had done that. And in doing it, he had changed the outcome for at least 3 women whose attackers' faces had been known to them, but whose names had not. He had given them a name. He had given them a verdict. He had given them the particular kind of closure that is not forgetting and is not healing, but is something solid and real, a line drawn at the end that says this person has been held accountable and cannot do this again. That is what the work produced. And late at night, when Brennan sat with all of it, with the footage in the suitcase and the mercury shirt and the name and the verdict, that was the thing he came back to. Not the applause, such as it was. Not the recognition. Not the narrative of the clever private detective who cracked the impossible case. Just the simple fact that he had looked at something long enough to see it. And that seeing had mattered. But even as the legal case came to its close, something was still unresolved in the part of the story that most people had not been paying attention to. Something that had been sitting quietly at the edge of the case from the very beginning. Something about the way the case had started. About who had been found in a field near the Everglades. About a young woman who asked for a lawyer before she asked for anything else. Because Anastasia's story was not finished. And before the full truth of this case could be understood, the questions that had circled around her from the start would need to be faced directly. Not to diminish what had been done to her. Never that. What had been done to her was real and terrible and monstrous. But the truth of a person can be complicated and still be true. The circumstances of a case can include things that are painful to look at directly and still be important to understand. Brennan had always known there were questions he had not fully answered. And now, with Jones convicted and the legal phase of the story drawing toward its conclusion, those questions were still there. Quieter, perhaps. Less urgent, but present. And they were about to come back to the surface. The questions about Anastasia had never really gone away. From the very beginning of the investigation, they had been there, moving beneath the surface of the case like a current beneath still water. Brennan had chosen, deliberately and consciously, to follow the evidence rather than to be distracted by the complications of the victim's own story. He had understood early on that the truth of what happened to a person and the legal or financial strategies that person might pursue in response to what happened to them are 2 different things, and that allowing one to contaminate your understanding of the other is a mistake. But he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that some aspects of Anastasia's situation had never been fully explained. She had asked for a lawyer when she woke up. Not a family member, not the police. A lawyer. The explanation for this, offered at the time and afterwards, was that she was a foreign national who was frightened and in pain, and who perhaps had been advised by someone connected to the cruise line to protect herself legally before speaking to authorities. That is a plausible explanation. It is the kind of thing that happens. But it sat in the back of Brennan's mind because nothing in a case like this should be taken entirely at face value, not as a conclusion, not as a point of assumed innocence or assumed guilt, but as something that deserved to be understood rather than set aside. The lawsuit against the hotel had been filed quickly. This too was not inherently suspicious. Hotels have insurance. They have legal liability for what happens to guests on their premises. A genuine victim of violence who was targeted while staying at a hotel has a legitimate claim against that hotel if it can be shown that the hotel's security failures contributed to their harm. These are the kinds of lawsuits that get filed. They are, in a broad sense, what the civil legal system exists to address. But the speed of it, the preparedness of it, the sense that someone who was barely conscious in a hospital bed had legal representation in place and a suit filed before the police investigation had moved much past its initial phase. These things had registered for Brennan and for Foote, and, presumably, for other investigators who were paying attention. The most sensitive version of the question, the one that investigators handled with care precisely because it was so easy to misuse, was whether Anastasia had any prior knowledge of the man who had attacked her. Not in the sense that she had invited the attack, not in any sense that reduced the reality of what had been done to her, but in the sense of whether she had known, or had reason to know, who Michael Lee Jones was before that night. The answer, as it emerged slowly through the course of the investigation, was not simple. Anastasia had been in the hotel for several days while recovering from her hand injury. Jones had also been in the hotel. In a hotel of that size, with guests moving through a limited number of shared spaces, elevators, lobbies, dining areas, corridors, it is not unusual for people staying at the same time to have some awareness of each other. The camera footage showed Jones in the elevator with her, but the footage also showed that they had been in the hotel at the same time for more than just that single elevator ride. The investigators considered the possibility that there had been some contact between them before the night of the attack. Not meaningful contact. Not the kind of contact that would reframe what happened as anything other than what the DNA said it was. But some awareness of each other's presence. Some exchange of pleasantries in a lobby or a hallway. The kind of brief interaction that happens in hotels all the time between strangers who are sharing a space for a few days. If that was the case, it might explain something that had puzzled investigators. Jones's choice of victim, in the context of his apparent pattern of behavior, seemed to involve people who were, in some sense, accessible to him. Not randomly selected from the entire population of people in a given city, but individuals who had crossed his path in the environment where he was operating. He used the cover of his presence at an event or a venue to identify and select. Anastasia had been there. She had been injured, which limited her mobility and perhaps made her more present in the shared spaces of the hotel than a fully mobile guest might be. She had been alone, without family or close friends nearby. She had been in a vulnerable position. This analysis was uncomfortable. It was the kind of analysis that requires very careful framing, because the instinct of anyone hearing it is to ask whether it means Anastasia did something wrong that contributed to what happened to her. The answer to that question is an absolute and unqualified no. Victims of violence do not create their attackers. Predators select targets, and the characteristics that make someone seem accessible or vulnerable to a predator are not failings on the part of the target. They are simply the features of a life that a calculating, opportunistic person read and exploited. But the analysis was also necessary, because understanding how Jones selected his victims was part of understanding Jones, and understanding Jones was part of building a complete picture of what had happened and why. The civil lawsuit against the hotel eventually moved through its own process, separate from and parallel to the criminal case. The civil proceedings and the criminal proceedings involved different standards of evidence, different burdens of proof, different procedures, and very often produce different outcomes even when they concern the same underlying events. The details of what happened in the civil proceeding were, for the most part, not public, handled within the legal processes that govern such cases and subject to the various agreements and confidentiality provisions that frequently attend civil settlements. What was clear was that Anastasia had survived, that she had recovered physically, as much as recovery from the kind of injuries she had sustained as possible, that she had pursued her legal rights in multiple forums, and that, whatever the complexities of the circumstances surrounding her case, she had been genuinely and terribly victimized by a man who was now convicted and incarcerated for that and other crimes. For Brennan, the questions about Anastasia resolved themselves the way many uncomfortable questions in investigations ultimately do. Not into simple answers, not into the kind of clean moral clarity that makes a story easy to tell, but into the acknowledgement that people are complicated, that victimhood is complicated, that the circumstances surrounding a crime are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. He had been asked, in various contexts, whether he believed Anastasia's account. His answer was always the same, and it was characteristically careful. He believed the DNA. He believed what the camera showed. He believed that Michael Lee Jones had committed the crime. About everything else, about the specific details of Anastasia's testimony, about the nature of any prior contact between them, about the motivations behind the lawsuit, he said that the evidence was what it was, and that he preferred to let it speak for itself rather than to overlay it with interpretations that could not be fully supported. It was a lawyerly answer for a man who was not a lawyer, but it was also, in its own way, honest. He had found the truth he was looking for. He had followed the evidence to a verdict. The rest of it, the human complexity that surrounded the case and would never be fully resolved, was not something that evidence could settle. The case would be written about and discussed, and eventually included in the growing body of true crime documentation that had, by the mid-2000s and into the following years, become one of the primary ways that the public engaged with the realities of violent crime and criminal investigation. Books were written, articles were published. Eventually, the story was documented in formats that reached audiences far beyond those who typically followed court proceedings. Brennan was, in all of these tellings, a central figure. The private detective who noticed what no one else noticed. The man who refused to let the case go cold. The investigator who built a theory that seemed impossible and then proved it with patience and obsession and a willingness to keep looking when everyone else had stopped. He accepted this role with characteristic understatement. He talked about the footage. He talked about the wheel. He talked about the Mercury shirt and the boat show and the phone calls. He did not talk much about himself, about the years of experience and the particular kind of training that had allowed him to see what he saw when he looked at that footage. He treated it as the natural consequence of doing the job correctly, which he supposed it was, even if the doing of it correctly had required something beyond ordinary diligence. But here is what he did say, in one interview, in a moment of relative openness that was not typical for him. He said that the thing that had broken the case open was not any single piece of evidence. It was the commitment to believing that the case was solvable. That commitment, he said, had been the hardest thing to maintain. Not the investigation itself, not the phone calls, or the subpoenas, or the trip to Frederick, Maryland, or the waiting for DNA results. The hard part was the belief, held against all the institutional weight of a cold case and a laughing room, that the answer was there and that it was worth finding. He said that most cases are not unsolvable. They are simply unlooked at. And he said that when he thought about all the other cases in all the other cold files in all the police departments in all the cities and counties in the country, he felt something he did not try to name. Not despair. Not exactly that. Something more like the awareness of an obligation. The awareness that paying attention to things other people dismiss is not a talent so much as a choice. And that the choice, made consistently and at some cost, is the only thing standing between truth and the silence that sometimes swallows it. He paused after saying that, and then he said something simpler. I hope people look, he said. I hope people keep looking. It was not a dramatic statement. It was not designed to be, but it stayed with everyone who heard it, in the particular way that simple, genuine things tend to stay. The case of the vanishing blonde, as it had come to be called in some of the coverage, was closed. Michael Lee Jones was in prison. The three linked victims had some form of justice. The hotel had been through its legal process. Ken Brennan had done what he had been hired to do, and then considerably more. But the story was not done being told. Because the story, as it turned out, was not just about this case. It was about something larger, something that the case illustrated but did not invent. It was about the gap between what surveillance technology captures and what human investigation notices. It was about the difference between having evidence and using evidence. It was about the way predators exploit the spaces between observation and attention, the spaces where cameras exist, but nobody is really watching. And it was about the particular kind of person who chooses to watch. Not everyone does. Most people, most of the time, do not. They look without seeing. They review without noticing. They check the boxes of an investigation without quite committing to the belief that the box still unchecked contains the answer. Brennan committed, and the wheel turned. Before this story can be fully understood, it has to be seen in its larger context. Not just as the story of one woman found in a field and one man caught because of a suitcase wheel, but as an illustration of something that was, and continues to be, a fundamental challenge in the investigation of violent crime. The challenge of the mobile predator. Michael Lee Jones was not unique in the most important structural sense. He was unique as an individual, as a specific person with a specific history and specific crimes attached to his name. But the pattern of his life, the pattern of moving from venue to venue and city to city, of working in environments that serve large crowds while remaining personally anonymous, of leaving each location before any investigation could fully develop, this pattern is not unique. It is a pattern that law enforcement has documented in multiple cases across multiple decades, a pattern that exploits specific weaknesses in the way crime investigation is organized. Criminal investigation in the United States is primarily organized by jurisdiction. Local police departments handle local crimes. County sheriffs handle county-level matters. State police handle state concerns. Federal agencies handle federal violations. This jurisdictional division is practical and has important constitutional justifications, but it creates a structural challenge when a criminal's activity crosses those jurisdictions deliberately or coincidentally. When a crime is committed in one city and the perpetrator moves to another city, the investigation of that crime belongs to the jurisdiction where it occurred. The investigators in that jurisdiction know what happened in their city. They do not know, and have no reliable mechanism for learning, what happened in other cities. Unless the evidence is specifically entered into a national database, and unless investigators in those other cities are actively looking for connections, the crimes remain isolated, each one unsolved in its own jurisdiction, none of them connected. This was the environment in which Michael Lee Jones operated for years. Not because he had designed it that way with sophisticated criminal intelligence. He may have understood, at some level, that his mobility was protection. The kind of understanding that comes not from strategic planning, but from having gotten away with things for a long time and having learned, in the intuitive way that experienced criminals learn, what makes them vulnerable and what makes them safe. But even if the design was not sophisticated, the effect was real. For years, Jones moved. For years, the crimes he left behind sat in isolated jurisdictions with no connection to each other. For years, the victims of those crimes lived without knowing what their attacker's name was, or where he had gone, or whether he was doing the same thing somewhere else. Cody's had changed that, or at least made it possible to change. The National DNA Database existed precisely to address this problem, to create a mechanism by which physical evidence from a crime in one state could be connected to physical evidence from a crime in another state, linking what would otherwise remain disconnected. It was a powerful tool. When it worked dramatically, producing connections that would never have been made otherwise. But Cody's only works if DNA evidence is collected and entered, and DNA evidence is only entered if it is collected. And it is only collected if an investigation reaches the point of processing evidence at the crime scene. Not every investigation reaches that point. Not every crime scene is processed with the thoroughness required to preserve and analyze DNA evidence. Not every victim reports, and not every report leads to an investigation that produces physical evidence. Brennan had thought about this extensively. The gap between what Cody's contained and what the actual scope of Jones's crimes might have been was not knowable. It was, by definition, the part that existed in silence, the part that the system had not reached. And sitting with that gap was something that investigators in cases like this had to learn to do, because the alternative, either pretending the gap does not exist or being paralyzed by the knowledge that it does, neither of those serves anyone. What serves people, Brennan believed, is exactly what had happened in this case. Someone paying attention. Someone deciding that a cold case is not necessarily an unsolvable case. Someone looking at footage that has already been reviewed and deciding to look again. He was one person. He had done what one person can do. The question of what systemic changes might reduce the frequency with which cases like this go cold in the first place, that was a larger question. It was a question for policymakers and administrators, and the people who design the protocols and allocate the resources that determine how investigations are conducted. It was important, but it was not Brennan's question to answer. His question had been simpler and more specific. What happened to Anastasia? He had answered it. In the period following the trial, a number of things shifted in how cases of this type were approached at the investigative level. Not dramatic, systemic overhauls. Those take years and sometimes never materialize, but incremental changes in practice. Greater attention to the possible cross-jurisdictional nature of sexual assault cases involving perpetrators who worked in mobile or event-based industries. More consistent entry of DNA evidence into CODIs, driven partly by the success of cases like the Jones investigation in demonstrating the value of that database. More attention to the possibility that a case going cold in one city might be connected to cases in other cities. Whether these changes would have caught a Jones earlier, in a world where he had begun his predatory behavior in a time before Brennan found the footage, is impossible to know. Counterfactual history is always speculation. What is knowable is that the case changed, in small but real ways, how investigators thought about certain kinds of mobile sexual predators. Foote received recognition for his work on the case, as did the other detectives and prosecutors involved in bringing it to its conclusion. He gave that recognition the understated acceptance that career law enforcement tends to give to commendations. He had done his job. The case had worked out. That was the whole of what he wanted to say about it, in the end. Brennan received attention of a different kind. The private investigator who had cracked the impossible case, who had spotted what no one else spotted, who had held a theory against all opposition until the evidence validated it. He was written about. He was profiled. He was, in certain circles, admired. He did not seem particularly changed by any of it. He continued to work cases. He continued to bring to them the same exhausting, obsessive attention to detail that had defined this one. He continued to be the kind of person who watches the same footage for the 14th time when everyone else stopped at the second. He said once, when asked whether the Jones case had changed how he thought about his work, that it had not changed the way he thought about it so much as it had confirmed something he had always believed. The answer is usually in the evidence, he said. The question is whether you are willing to look at the evidence long enough to find it. That sounds simple, he acknowledged. It sounds like something you would put on a motivational poster in a break room somewhere. But the simplicity is deceptive. Looking at evidence is easy. Looking at evidence long enough and carefully enough and with enough willingness to be wrong and to adjust and to start over and to look again, that is not easy. That requires something that is hard to maintain over the course of a long and frustrating and uncertain investigation. He called it faith. Not religious faith. Not any kind of metaphysical commitment. Just the operational belief that the truth exists and that looking for it is not a waste of time. Most people, he said, give up on that faith at some point in a hard case. They decide that the evidence does not support a conclusion, or that the investigation has reached its natural limit, or that the resources would be better spent elsewhere. And sometimes they are right. Sometimes cases do not get solved because they cannot be solved with the available evidence. Sometimes the answer really is not there. But sometimes the answer is there, and the investigation stopped anyway. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the individual case, not Jones specifically, but the category of stopped investigations that did not have to stop. The cold cases that were not cold because the evidence was gone, but because the looking had stopped. He thought about the detective who had reviewed the airport Regency footage before him. He was careful about this, and he was clear about it in any context where it came up. He did not criticize that detective. He did not imply that the earlier failure to see what he had seen was a result of incompetence or laziness or bad faith. Investigations are resource-constrained, time-constrained, and subject to the priorities that come with managing large caseloads in a major urban police department. The detective who had reviewed the footage had looked at it. He had not seen what Brennan saw. That was a real difference, but it was not the kind of difference that warranted blame. What it warranted was the kind of reflection that Brennan engaged in. The honest assessment of what made the difference. Not what made him smarter than the detective who came before him, but what made the second look different from the first. He came to it because he had been hired to find the hotel liable or to exonerate it. He had a specific, financially motivated reason to look at that footage with unusual care. He had an adversarial relationship to the question in the best sense. He was looking for something to use, and that hunger had sharpened his attention in ways that a general review of evidence does not always produce. The detective before him had been looking to see if anything was there. Brennan had been looking to find something, knowing it had to be there, because he could not explain the crime otherwise. That difference, subtle as it sounds, had produced a different result. He thought about what that meant, about the possibility of structuring investigations to replicate that hunger more systematically, to give investigators a reason to look not just at what the evidence shows, but at what the evidence must be hiding. He did not have a fully formed policy proposal. He was not that kind of thinker, but the idea lodged in him and stayed. And in the quiet of the aftermath, in the days and weeks after the verdict had come in and the attention had begun to fade and Michael Lee Jones had settled into the first years of what would likely be the rest of his life behind bars, Brennan went back to work. There were other cases. There always were. Let us go back to the beginning of it. Not the beginning of the investigation, but the beginning of what made the investigation necessary. Let us go back to the night itself, to what the footage shows in its most granular detail, because understanding the mechanics of what happened is the only way to fully appreciate how close this case came to remaining permanently unsolved. The Airport Regency Hotel in Miami sits near the airport, as its name suggests. It is a functional, mid-range property that serves a practical purpose for its guests, a stopping point rather than a destination. The kind of hotel where business people sleep between flights, where airline crews rest between schedules, where people in transit find a bed for the night. It is not the kind of hotel that attracts attention. It is not the kind of hotel that would normally appear in any kind of national story. The security system it operated was standard for a property of its type in the mid-2000s. Analog cameras feeding into a recording system that captured the major common areas. Not the last word in surveillance technology even then, and certainly not the high-definition, networked, remotely monitored systems that have become standard in the years since. Grainy enough that faces require careful study, wide angle enough that specific details require patient magnification, but functional, recording, doing what it was designed to do. On the night in question, the hotel was at a reasonable occupancy. Guests were moving through the common areas at the kinds of hours that hotel guests move at, which is to say at all of them. The lobby, the elevators, the corridors, populated in the uneven way that hotels always are. Some people heading out for late nights in the city, some people returning from dinners and events, some people simply moving between floors for the quiet reasons that people have in the middle of the night. Among these guests, at various points through the evening and into the early morning hours, were two people whose paths would intersect in a way that one of them had apparently planned and the other had no idea was coming. Anastasia had returned to the hotel in the early hours, having spent some of the evening out. She was young and in recovery from her hand injury, and presumably doing the things that young people do when they are in a city and they have time and the injury is not so severe that it grounds them entirely. She came back through the lobby looking tired in the way that late nights produce, the kind of tiredness that is not unpleasant but that tells the body it is time. She pressed the elevator button. She waited. The doors opened, and there was Jones. Brennan had studied this moment with extraordinary care. He had thought about what it would have looked like from Anastasia's perspective, stepping into an elevator and finding it occupied by a man she may or may not have seen before in the shared spaces of the hotel over the preceding days. Jones at that moment, from the available footage, appeared relaxed, not agitated, not alert in any way that would signal danger. Just a large man in an elevator at an odd hour, going about whatever business he appeared to be going about. There is a psychology to shared elevator rides that most people understand instinctively. Two strangers in a small, enclosed space. The understood social contract of eyes forward, minimal conversation, the brief suspension of normal social interaction until the doors open and everyone disperses. Jones would have understood this contract. He would have occupied the space in a way that seemed unremarkable. He would have pressed a floor button if one needed pressing. He would have been present in the elevator the way that any large, quiet, apparently innocuous man is present in an elevator. And Anastasia, tired and injured and thinking about her bed, would have had no reason to feel anything other than the ordinary mild social awareness of being briefly enclosed with a stranger before the doors opened and they went their separate ways. She pressed 4. The elevator moved. The doors opened on the 4th floor. She stepped out. She moved toward her room. The keycard log recorded her entry at 3:44 in the morning. What happened after that, inside that room, before the sequence of events that ended with a suitcase being wheeled through a lobby at 5:28 in the morning, is something that the cameras did not capture and that the evidence cannot reconstruct with the precision required to describe it in full detail. What is known from the DNA evidence, from the nature of Anastasia's injuries, from Jones's ultimate conviction, is that violence occurred. Severe, extended, brutal violence. The kind that leaves a person nearly dead in a field 8 miles away. Jones's movements after the elevator, tracked through whatever camera angles captured him, showed him going where he appeared to be going. His floor, presumably. His room. And then, in the gap between 3:44 and 5:28, a gap of 1 hour and 44 minutes, the camera record loses him, because whatever happened in the private space of a hotel room that no camera reached. And then 5:28, the elevator camera again, the doors opening, Jones emerging, pulling the suitcase behind him, moving across the lobby with the measured pace of a man who knows where he is going. Not hurrying, because hurrying attracts attention. Not shuffling, because shuffling communicates guilt. Just moving, at the pace of someone who has every right to be in the space they are moving through, doing the thing they are doing at the hour they are doing it. The lobby was quiet. The front desk was staffed, but at 5:28 in the morning, a night shift desk clerk is engaged in their own management of the slow, drowsy hours before the day shift arrives. The security guard on duty was present, but presence and active surveillance are different things. People see what they expect to see. A large man pulling a suitcase through a hotel lobby at an unusual hour looks like a large man with an early flight. Jones crossed the lobby. The parking lot camera caught him as he exited. He moved through the lot. He loaded the suitcase into whatever vehicle he had. He drove 8 miles to the edge of the Everglades. And then the suitcase opened, and Anastasia was left in the grass. And Jones drove back to the hotel and returned the empty suitcase to wherever he had obtained it and went back to his room. And the camera caught him coming back through the lobby. Without the suitcase, that is the sequence, laid out in its bare mechanics, stripped of interpretation and analysis, and everything except what the footage showed and what the evidence supported. It is a sequence of events so cold in its execution, so methodical in its detail, so completely devoid of apparent emotion or panic or the evidence of anything other than a plan being followed, that it is difficult to sit with. Brennan had sat with it many times. He said once that the footage had affected him in ways he did not fully process in the moment, that while he was studying it, he was in investigative mode, looking for the information in it rather than experiencing the reality of it. But later, in quieter moments, the reality of it had landed differently. The understanding of what those pixels represented. The understanding that behind the image of a large man pulling a rolling suitcase was a human being, a 21-year-old woman from Ukraine who had come to America to work and build something, and who was, in that moment on that camera, inside a bag. He said it was the most disturbing footage he had ever studied, and he had studied a lot of footage in his career. What he kept coming back to, what he could not set aside and eventually stop trying to, was the question of how many times Jones had done this before. Not how many times had been confirmed by DNA and entered into Cody's. How many times, in the full, uncountable sense. How many hotel lobbies and how many parking lots and how many drives in the dark. Because the competence of the execution suggested practice. The absence of panic, the control of pace and appearance, the use of a method that was audacious enough to be almost unimaginable, but that had been carried out in plain sight and gone undetected until someone studied 14 frames of an elevator camera long enough to notice a wheel catching on a threshold. That competence was not born in a single night. It had been developed, over time, in other cities, against other people. This was the shadow that fell over every conversation about the victory that the Jones conviction represented. It was a real victory. It was a genuine and important outcome. But it arrived at the end of a pattern that had been operating for years, and the part of that pattern that remained invisible was, in the nature of things, the part that would never be fully illuminated. Brennan accepted this. He had to. The alternative was a kind of paralysis that did not serve anyone. But he did not pretend the shadow was not there. He thought about the women who had reported, whose cases had gone cold, who had lived with that open ending. He thought about the ones who had not reported, who were living with a different kind of open ending. He thought about the families of all of them. About the way this kind of violence, even when it does not kill the victim, changes the texture of a life in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but that are present in every room, in every relationship, and every night that is harder to sleep through than it should be. He thought about what he could not do, and then, because there was nothing else to do with it, he thought about what he had done. He had looked, he had seen, he had built the case. That was the work. And somewhere, in a courtroom in Colorado, a jury had taken what the work had produced and used it to do what juries are supposed to do. It was not enough, if enough means addressing everything that needed to be addressed. But it was what was possible. And in the world of what was possible, it was real and it was complete, and it had changed things for people who had not, for years, had anything changed for them. Brennan went home. He thought about the next case. Before the full picture of this story comes into focus, something needs to be said about the women at its center. All of them, not just Anastasia, whose experience opened the investigation and whose case eventually produced the arrest, but the women in New Orleans, the woman in Colorado, the women whose names are not in this telling, whose cases may never be officially connected, who experienced what they experienced in cities that Michael Lee Jones moved through and left behind. This is the part of a true crime story that is hardest to tell honestly, because the momentum of investigation and detection and legal procedure tends to move the lens toward the investigators, toward the puzzle solving, toward the dramatic moments of insight and the mechanics of justice. And the victims, the actual human beings whose suffering was the origin of everything else, can end up as context for a story that is fundamentally about someone else. Brennan was aware of this. He talked about it, carefully and without performative emotion. He said that the thing he was proudest of about the investigation was not that he had found Jones. It was that he had refused to stop looking for Anastasia's attacker when institutional momentum was moving toward letting the case go cold. That refusal, he said, was motivated entirely by the fact that a woman had been found nearly dead in a field and deserved to have someone take that seriously. Everything else followed from that. Let us take a moment to sit with the women in New Orleans. The city of New Orleans, in the years that Jones operated, there was a city with its own enormous burdens. Even before the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans had been a city of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary difficulty, a place where the violence that accompanies poverty and neglect had always been concentrated in ways that made certain communities particularly vulnerable and certain crimes particularly likely to go unaddressed. Jones had worked in New Orleans. He had been in that city during a period when its investigative and judicial systems were strained, when the record-keeping was disrupted, when people were scattered and tracking anyone's movements had become significantly more difficult. The 2 rapes in New Orleans that were linked to his DNA through Cody's were not the product of that disruption. They had occurred and been reported and processed as evidence. But the investigation of those cases had reached the same wall that the Miami case had initially reached, the wall where a victim describes an attacker, but the attacker cannot be identified. For the women in New Orleans, the years between their assault and the Cody's match were years of living with an open case. Years of knowing that the man who had hurt them was somewhere and that no one knew where. Years of the particular kind of psychological burden that comes with unresolved violence, the not knowing, the possibility of encounter, the absence of a conclusion that allows the mind to begin to move past something. When the Cody's match came through, when investigators were able to go back to those women and tell them that the man had been found, that his name was Michael Lee Jones, that he was in custody, that he had been convicted in Colorado and would likely be in prison for the rest of his life, those conversations were significant. Not simple, not the arrival of a clean and comfortable closure. Closure is rarely clean or comfortable when the thing being closed is something like this, but significant, the ending of the not knowing, or at least one dimension of it. The Colorado victim had gone through the trial. She had sat in a courtroom and testified. She had submitted herself to cross-examination by defense attorneys whose job was to challenge her account and create doubt and find any vulnerability in her testimony that could be exploited in service of their client's defense. She had done all of this, and then she had waited for the verdict. There is a particular quality to a courtroom when a verdict is about to be delivered. The room holds its breath in a way that has nothing to do with theater and everything to do with the weight of what is about to be said. This is the moment that everything has been building toward, not just the trial, but the investigation, and before the investigation, the crime itself, and before the crime, whatever set of circumstances produced the encounter that preceded it. All of that compression, all of that accumulated weight of time and pain and effort, and it comes down to 12 people in a room in a single sentence. Guilty. The Colorado victim heard that word spoken. She heard the verdict. She had known it was coming, or hoped it was coming, in the way that people hope for things that they have not allowed themselves to fully believe. And then it came. Whatever she felt in that moment, whatever happened inside her when the word landed, is not something this account has access to. It is hers. It belongs to her private experience in the same way that the experience of the crime belonged to her private experience. But that it mattered, that it changed something, even if it did not change everything, even if it did not undo any of what had been done, seems beyond doubt. And for Anastasia, wherever she was in the months and years following the investigation and the trial, the answer to the question that had surrounded her case from the very beginning was at least partially resolved. Not the lawsuit, not the legal complexities of her civil case, but the fundamental question of who had done this to her. That question had an answer now. The answer was documented. The answer had a name attached to it, and a conviction and a sentence. Michael Lee Jones, the man in the elevator, the man with the suitcase, the man who had assumed that his size and his charm and his practiced normalcy were enough to protect him indefinitely from the consequences of what he did. He had been wrong. He had been wrong because one private detective refused to accept that the case was over. Brennan had been asked, more than once, what motivated him to keep looking when the easier choice was to accept the conclusion that everyone else had reached. He had been asked what quality in him, what professional stubbornness or personal conviction or simple refusal to be defeated had produced the outcome that it did. He usually deflected these questions. He did not like talking about himself, and he particularly did not like the version of the story where he was the heroic figure whose exceptional personal qualities saved the day. That was not how he understood it. That was not how he wanted it understood. But when pressed, he would say something like this. He had looked at Anastasia's injuries in the documentation from the hospital. He had seen the photographs of what had been done to her. And at some point during the investigation, when the momentum was toward letting the case go cold, and when the evidence seemed not to be moving anywhere productive, he had come back to those photographs and looked at them again, not to disturb himself, not as a form of self-punishment for his failure to find the answer yet, but to remind himself of the reality of what the question being left unanswered represented. The question was not an intellectual puzzle. The question was a real human being who had experienced something real and devastating and who deserved an answer. That was all. That was the motivation. He said it simply enough that it could sound like it was simple. But holding on to that kind of motivation through weeks of dead ends and cold leads and laughing rooms requires something that is not nothing. It requires the ability to keep the human reality of the case in view even when the investigation is buried in the procedural and the technical and the frustrating. It requires not letting the abstraction of investigation replace the concrete reality of what started it. Most investigators have this quality to some degree. All of the good ones do. The ability to remember, through the grind of the work, what the work is for. Brennan had it in unusual abundance. And in this case, that abundance was the difference between a cold case that stayed cold and a verdict that was delivered in a Colorado courtroom to a woman who had been waiting for it longer than she should have had to wait. The story does not end with the verdict, in the way that all stories about violence don't fully end with their legal conclusions. The legal system provides a punctuation mark, a moment at which a formal record says this person did this thing, and this is the consequence. But punctuation is not resolution. It is just a pause. Life continues around it. Anastasia was, by all accounts, rebuilding hers. The specifics of that rebuilding are not available, as they should not be. They belong to her. She had been through something that would take years to process. If processing is even the right word for the relationship a person develops with the worst thing that has ever happened to them. She had been through the investigation, the lawsuit, the legal processes, the attention, the doubt that had swirled around her account, even when the DNA said what it said. She had survived all of it. in the same sense that she had survived the night itself. Not undamaged, not unchanged, but alive and moving forward in whatever direction forward took her. The women in New Orleans were living their lives. The woman in Colorado was living hers. And Michael Lee Jones was not living his. Not in any meaningful sense. He was sitting in the particular silence of incarceration, which is not the silence of peace, but the silence of elimination, of being removed from the world's capacity to be moved or shaped by you. He was not moving from city to city. He was not pulling suitcases through lobbies. He was not standing behind concession counters with an easy smile. He was done. And somewhere in that fact, in the small and precise and completely specific fact of Michael Lee Jones being done, there was something worth noting. It had taken a long time to get there. It had required a lot of work by a lot of people, some of whom had titles and badges and jurisdiction, and some of whom had a retainer from a hotel's insurance company and a willingness to look at the same footage 17 times. But it had gotten there. And the path from the beginning to the end had run directly through a moment that nobody else had thought mattered. A wheel. A threshold, a fraction of a second on a grainy hotel camera in the small hours of a Florida winter morning. That was the hinge. That was the thing on which all of it turned. And it had almost not been noticed. If you are still watching, if you have stayed with this story through the discovery and the investigation and the arrest and the verdict, then you understand something about why this case matters beyond the specific details of the crime and the people involved in it. You understand that this is a story about attention. About what happens when someone decides to pay it fully and what happens when someone else has decided not to. But now let us go back and look at Ken Brennan one more time. Not as the heroic central figure of a solved mystery, but as a working investigator doing a job that required him to be honest about what he did not know as much as about what he did know. Because there is something about his account of the investigation that is easy to smooth over in the retelling. The moments of uncertainty. The hours when the Mercury Marine shirt meant nothing yet. The days between finding the name Mike Jones and finding the man himself. When the trail had gone cold enough that a less stubborn investigator would have set it aside and moved to something more tractable. Those moments are the reality of investigative work. Not the flash of insight. Not the triumphant following of a thread to its end. But the sitting with not knowing. The performing of tasks whose relevance is not yet clear. The making of phone calls that go nowhere before making the one that goes somewhere. There is a moment in Brennan's account of the investigation that he returned to often when he talked about the case. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the moment when the DNA came back, or when Jones was arrested, or when the verdict was delivered. It was a quieter moment, and he described it without ornament or emphasis, almost as an aside. He described an afternoon, midway through the investigation, when he was sitting with the footage again. Not looking for something specific, not in the mode of active pursuit, following a lead, checking a theory, just sitting with it, watching it in the unfocused way that you sometimes watch something you have watched many times, when the active part of the brain is stepped back and the watching is almost passive, almost like letting the images move through you rather than processing them against a specific question. He said that in that state, the afternoon light falling across the room, the footage running, he had experienced a moment of something he could only describe as certainty. Not certainty about a specific piece of evidence. Not certainty that he had found the answer, but certainty that the answer was there. That the footage contained what he needed, and that he had not misread it, and that the man with the suitcase was the man he believed he was. He said it was not a logical certainty. He could not have built an argument from it. It was more like the internal resolution of a long-held doubt. The moment when something that has been uncertain in the body as well as the mind finally settles. He went back to work with renewed focus after that. He did not tell anyone about the moment, then or afterwards. He mentioned it only much later, in the context of a conversation about the experience of sustained investigation, about what it requires and what it costs, and what it occasionally gives back. He said he thought it was important to be honest about those moments, because they exist. Because investigators, even the most rigorous and evidence-focused investigators, are not machines. They have intuitions and emotional responses to evidence and moments of certainty that arrive before the logical apparatus that would justify them. And pretending that they do not, pretending that all of the work is purely rational and systematic, is a form of dishonesty that ultimately does not serve the understanding of how good investigative work actually gets done. Good investigative work, he said, requires both the rigorous logic and the sustained belief, the careful examination of evidence, and the refusal to abandon the conviction that the evidence contains something worth finding. One without the other produces either a mechanism that can analyze evidence but has no instinct for where to look, or an intuition that lacks the disciplined foundation needed to actually prove what it senses. He had both, not in perfect balance on any given day, but over the course of the investigation, both were present, working together in the imperfect, human, unglamorous way that real investigative work actually operates. This is relevant to the understanding of the case because it points towards something about why the case succeeded where it might have failed. It was not just the Mercury Marine shirt. It was not just the suitcase wheel. It was not even just the patience to watch the footage again and again. It was the maintenance, through all of those things, of the belief that they were worth doing. And that belief had been challenged. The hotel lawyers who laughed when he presented the suitcase theory were not unintelligent people. They were experienced legal professionals with good instincts about the credibility of evidence and the plausibility of arguments. Their laughter was not contemptuous. It was the response of people who had heard an idea that sounded, on its face, too dramatic to be taken seriously. Brennan could have been deflected by that. It would have been reasonable to reconsider, to ask himself whether he was chasing a theory because it was compelling rather than because it was supported, whether the elegance of the suitcase explanation had seduced him into giving it more weight than the evidence warranted. He did ask himself that, and he answered it by going back to the evidence and looking at it again. The answer was still there. The wheel was still catching on the threshold. The weight of the suitcase was still apparent in the way the man had to pull it. The absence of any other explanation for how Anastasia had left the building was still complete. Nothing about the laughter changed the evidence. Nothing about the skepticism of experienced lawyers altered what the camera had recorded. So he had held the theory, and the DNA had proved it. In a professional sense, that was the resolution. Theory proposed, evidence gathered, DNA confirmed, arrest made, conviction secured. The story has the shape of a case that went the way a case should go, from question to answer, from crime to justice. But the emotional texture of it, the reality of what it felt like to carry that case through those weeks and those dead ends and those moments of doubt, is something that gets compressed in the retelling. The facts line up neatly in retrospect. The clues seem obvious once you know what they mean. The decision to go to Frederick, Maryland feels inevitable once you know it was the right decision. None of it felt inevitable at the time. That is the thing about real work, as opposed to the narrativized version of it. Real work happens in the absence of the ending. It happens when the investigation is still open, when the answer is still unknown, when the theory might be wrong, when the next phone call might produce nothing, when the suitcase might mean exactly what it appears to mean, which is a man checking out early and nothing more. Real work happens in the dark before the light comes. And what Brennan did, what Foote did alongside him, what the prosecutors in Colorado did when they took what they had and built a case with it, was the real work. The unglamorous, uncertain, grinding real work of pursuing truth in the absence of certainty. The light came eventually, but first, for a long time, there was just the work. And somewhere in a hotel room, and a lobby, and a parking lot, and a field near the Everglades, a young woman was waiting for someone to do it. She did not know who that person would be. She did not know his name, or his history, or the particular quality of his attention. She did not know that a private investigator hired by a hotel's insurance company would be the one who refused to let her case go. She did not know about the Mercury Marine shirt, or the boat show, or the phone calls, or the subpoena, or any of it. She just knew what had been done to her, and she had asked for a lawyer. In her way, that was its own kind of fight. Whatever the complications of her legal strategy, whatever the questions that surrounded her case and her account, she had refused to simply accept what had happened and disappear. She had pushed back in the ways available to her, had engaged the systems around her, had not gone quietly. She had survived, and that survival had made it possible for Brennan to find the evidence. Because without her, there is no hotel security footage to review. There is no case file to share. There is no DNA to collect. There is no trail to follow to Frederick, Maryland, and a man standing behind a barbecue counter with an easy smile. Without her surviving, Michael Lee Jones continues. That is the simple, terrible arithmetic of it. She survived, and because she survived, it stopped. Not just for her. For the women in New Orleans and Colorado whose cases were finally closed. For the future victims who did not become victims because the man who would have made them victims is behind bars. One survival, expanding outward in time. The mathematics of the unlived crime, of the harm that did not happen because of what she survived, cannot be fully calculated. But it is real. It is the invisible ledger on the other side of the violence, the accounting of the future that was changed because the present was changed. And in that accounting, this young Ukrainian woman who came to America to work on a cruise ship and recovered from a hand injury at an airport hotel and survived something that should have killed her, she is not just a victim. She is, in the full and complicated and unromanticized sense of the word, a survivor whose survival mattered in ways that extended far beyond her own life. That matters. It needs to be said. She matters. They all do. Now let us take a step back from the specific and the personal and sit with the thing that this case reveals about the world it happened in. Because the individual story of Michael Lee Jones and his victims and the investigation that ultimately brought him to justice is embedded in a much larger set of realities about how violence works and how it is addressed and how the gap between those two things can be wide enough to allow a predator to operate for years. The world that Jones moved through was a world of large events and temporary workers and massive, impersonal venues where individual identity is obscured by the scale of the crowd. Sports stadiums, convention centers, trade shows. These are places designed to hold tens of thousands of people at a time, places where the infrastructure of food and service requires an enormous labor force, places where workers cycle through on seasonal or contract basis without the institutional visibility that comes with long-term, fixed employment. This invisibility is not sinister in itself. It is simply the reality of how large-scale event labor operates. But it created, for Jones, a kind of structural cover. The food service worker is a background figure at the events he works. He is present, often in uniform, often smiling, often facilitating a service that visitors want and appreciate. He is, in the most functional sense, part of the furniture. There but not seen, present but not noticed. Jones understood this, consciously or not. He understood that the uniform and the counter and the name badge created a kind of social permission, a stamp of harmlessness that made the natural human alertness to potential danger relax in a way it might not relax in other contexts. A large, powerful stranger approaching you in an isolated location is something the brain flags immediately. A large, powerful concession worker handing you a beer at a sporting event is invisible, part of the expected landscape, cataloged and dismissed before any threat assessment can be made. He used that invisibility. He used it to identify people, to make initial assessments, to determine who was alone, who was vulnerable, who represented an opportunity. And then, when the work shift ended and the event closed, and everyone dispersed back to their hotels and their temporary accommodations, he moved. The victims found by Cody's were women who had been in proximity to the venues where Jones worked. The details of how the contacts occurred, the specific circumstances of each case, varied. But the pattern was consistent enough to confirm that Jones was operating in a deliberate way, selecting based on criteria that the investigators who studied his cases believed included isolation and physical vulnerability and the opportunity provided by proximity to where he was already legitimately present. This pattern had gone undetected for years not because it was subtle, but because it crossed jurisdictions in a way that made it invisible to any single investigative entity. Each case was one case. Each detective saw one crime with one victim and one unknown perpetrator. Nobody saw the pattern because the pattern was distributed across a geography that no individual investigator was positioned to survey. Cody's had the capability to reveal the pattern, but Cody's only reveals what is entered into it. And DNA from a crime scene only gets entered into Cody's if the crime is investigated and the evidence is properly collected and processed and submitted. Not every case achieves all of those steps. Resource constraints, jurisdictional priorities, the decisions made in the immediate aftermath of a reported crime about how much investigative attention it warrants. All of these factors determine whether the physical evidence from a particular crime enters the national database. In the cases linked to Jones, the evidence had been collected and submitted. 3 matches had been returned. The investigators who studied his full pattern of movement believed it was likely incomplete. They could not prove additional cases with the available evidence. But the logic of his behavior, the years of mobility, the cities he had passed through, the events he had worked, made it statistically unlikely that 3 confirmed cases represented the full extent of his criminal activity. That is a dark conclusion. It is the kind of conclusion that law enforcement professionals reach in cases like this and do not share publicly with unnecessary frequency, because sharing it serves no one particularly well. It does not help the investigation, which has found what it has found. It does not help the identified victims, who have more than enough to process already. And it does not help the public, which does not benefit from the generalized anxiety that comes with knowing that the crimes of a convicted predator probably exceeded what has been officially documented. But the investigators know, and the investigators carry it. It becomes part of the motivation for the systemic improvements that cases like this occasionally produce. Not because systemic improvement is easy or fast, but because the knowledge that something has been missed creates at least the possibility of an obligation to try to miss less of it next time. In the years following the Jones case, there were discussions at various levels of law enforcement about how to improve the identification and tracking of mobile sexual predators, how to ensure more consistent entry of DNA evidence into CODIs, how to build better communication across jurisdictions in cases involving perpetrators whose lifestyle made them difficult to locate within any single investigative territory. These discussions produced results of varying impact. Some practical changes in procedure, some improvements in communication protocols, the slow, institutional adaptation of a system that is large and complex and resistant to rapid change by its nature. It was not nothing. It was also not everything. The gap between what happened and what the response was capable of producing remains, as it always does, somewhere imprecisely in the middle. Enough to know that some of what should have been learned has been learned. Not enough to know that similar patterns won't go undetected for similar periods of time in the future. Brennan was not optimistic about this in any naive sense. He was realistic, which is different. He believed that the tools existed, in most cases, to do better than the system typically managed to do. He believed that the constraints were more often about attention and will than about capability. He believed that a determined investigator with access to the right tools and the right information could, in most cases, do what he had done in the Jones investigation. But he also understood that the distribution of determination is uneven, that the resources available to investigations are limited, that the caseloads carried by overworked detectives in understaffed departments often make the kind of sustained, obsessive attention he had brought to this case simply impossible as a regular practice. This was not a criticism of the investigators who had come before him on the case. It was a structural observation. The individual detective who had reviewed the airport Regency footage before Brennan had not been lazy or indifferent or incompetent. They had been a detective in a major urban police department with hundreds of active cases and limited time, and the expectation that reviewing one set of hotel security footage was part of their work, not the whole of it. Brennan had been hired for this specific case, this specific footage, this specific question. His attention had not been divided in the same way, and that difference, institutional rather than personal, had produced a different result. It made him think about what it would mean to build systems that replicated that kind of focused, specific attention more reliably, not as a matter of individual genius or exceptional dedication, but as a structural feature of how investigations are organized and resourced. He did not have a policy prescription. He was not that kind of person, but the thought was there, and it was the thought of someone who understood the problem from the inside, from the specific, granular experience of having been the person who looked until they saw something. The answer to how we do better, he suggested, is probably not primarily about technology. The cameras were already there. The recording was already happening. The evidence was already captured. The technology had done its job. The gap was in the human side. The sustained attention. The refusal to accept cold. The willingness to look at the same footage for the 17th time on the chance that the 17th time is the one that breaks it open. That is a human problem with a human solution. And the human solution, the answer that the Jones case actually demonstrated, is not one person with exceptional qualities. It is the belief, made operational through practice and through institutional support, that every case deserves to be looked at as fully as this one was. Not every case gets solved. Some cases are genuinely unsolvable with available evidence. Some crimes leave no trails. Some perpetrators are never identified, but some are. And the difference, sometimes, is exactly this small. A will catching on a threshold. A person willing to watch until they see it. If you are still here with this story, I want you to think for a moment about what you have heard. Not the details of the investigation or the mechanics of the crime or the names and the DNA and the courtrooms. Think about the architecture of the thing. Think about how it was built and what it rested on and what would have had to be different for it to have collapsed. It rested on a woman surviving. That is the first thing. If the utility worker had driven past the spot in the grass without slowing down, if the emergency response had arrived minutes later, if the injuries had been slightly more severe, the case might have started with a body rather than a victim. And starting with a body changes everything, because a body, terrible as it is, often reveals less than a survivor. Less testimony, even fragmented testimony. Less legal standing. Less possibility of the lawsuit that brought in Ken Brennan. Survival was the first pillar. The second pillar was the recording. The Airport Regency Hotel had security cameras covering its common areas. Not extraordinary cameras, not state-of-the-art, but present, functional recording. The footage existed. This seems unremarkable because it is routine, but it is worth noting that the footage that broke the case was not specially installed or specifically positioned to capture a crime in progress. It was ordinary hotel security infrastructure doing its ordinary job, and that ordinary job happened to include the recording of one man pulling one suitcase across one lobby at 5:28 in the morning. The footage was the second pillar. The third pillar was the willingness to look at it again. Not the first review, not the police review that had produced no leads, but Brennan's review. The second look. The look that nobody asked for except the investigation itself. If the investigation had a voice and could demand what it needed. Those three pillars, survival, recording, and the second look, all had to be present simultaneously for the case to go where it went. Remove any one of them and the story ends differently. It ends colder. It ends with a file in a pile and a woman whose attacker was never found and a man who continued moving from city to city and event to event. This is not a comfortable thing to contemplate. The dependence of justice on factors that are essentially contingent, on a utility worker slowing down, on a hotel having cameras, on a private investigator deciding to review the footage one more time, is uncomfortable precisely because it is real. Justice, in the real world, is contingent in ways that the ideal of it is not. The ideal of justice is that it arrives inevitably, that truth will out, that the evidence will speak and be heard and produce the appropriate conclusion. The reality is that truth requires someone to listen for it, and listening is not guaranteed. Brennan had listened, and he wanted to talk about what that meant in a practical sense, not in an inspirational sense. Not the encouraging version of the story where his determination is held up as a model to be admired and emulated, but the realistic version, where his determination is understood as a response to a specific set of conditions that made it possible. He had been given time. He had been retained specifically for this case. He had not been managing a caseload of 40 other investigations simultaneously while trying to find the space to review hotel footage. He had been hired, with specific financial resources, to do this work. The hotel's insurance company had determined that it was worth the investment to find out what had actually happened, because what had actually happened had implications for the lawsuit, and therefore implications for how much money would ultimately change hands. Justice, in this instance, was served by the machinery of civil liability. An insurance company's financial interest in limiting its exposure had produced a retainer for a private investigator whose obsessive attention to detail had found a serial predator. That is an uncomfortable way to describe it. It does not have the clarity of a story where someone does the right thing for purely virtuous reasons. It complicates the moral architecture of the case in ways that are worth sitting with. But it also reflects something real. Systems produce outcomes. Incentives shape behavior. The incentive structure of civil litigation, in this case, created the conditions that made the second look possible. That second look produced evidence that identified a serial rapist and ultimately led to a criminal conviction. The pathway from insurance liability to justice in a criminal courtroom runs through some strange territory, but it runs there nonetheless. Brennan understood this. He did not pretend the motivation behind his hiring was pure. He did not need to pretend. The work was the work, regardless of what had generated the retainer. The footage was the footage, regardless of whose financial interest had prompted someone to look at it more carefully. The outcome was the outcome. He had, over the course of his career, learned to be comfortable with the moral complexity of investigative work. The idea that good outcomes are sometimes produced by impure motivations, that systems designed for one purpose occasionally serve another purpose better, that the pathway from a crime to its resolution is not always as direct or as clean as anyone would prefer. These realities were simply part of the landscape of the work. What he had not made his peace with, and what he did not pretend to have made his peace with, was the suffering that the complexity failed to prevent. The women who were hurt before anyone was looking. The years between Jones's first crime and his last crime. The period in which he moved and selected and hurt and moved on again. The victims who reported and were not believed, or whose cases were investigated and stalled, or who never reported at all. Those are the costs that the outcome does not offset. They happened. The conviction does not unhappen them. The sentence does not restore what was taken. But the conviction does stop the ongoing accumulation of the cost. It says, from this date forward, no more. And in the arithmetic of prevented harm, that is something. It is not nothing. It is the thing that the work was for. Brennan went home after the verdict. He made himself a cup of coffee. He sat at a table in whatever room he sat in when the cases were done and the work was finished, at least for now. At least until the next file arrived on his desk. And he thought about a 21-year-old Ukrainian woman lying in the grass near the Everglades. He thought about her surviving. And he thought about a wheel. And he was glad he had looked. That was what he allowed himself to feel at the end of all of it. Not pride, because pride seemed too much about him and too little about the thing that had happened. Not triumph, because the trial and the sentence were not about him winning anything. Something simpler than either. Something closer to relief, or to the specific emotion that exists in the space where relief and grief meet. The acknowledgement that something terrible had been addressed as fully as it could be addressed, that the system had reached the outcome it was supposed to reach, and that the next part of this story, whatever it was, would be lived by the people in it rather than by the investigator who had spent months trying to find out what had happened. His part was done. The work was done. And in the morning there would be new work. There always was. But not tonight. Tonight he sat with the coffee and the quiet and the particular kind of peace that is not calm, but is the absence, finally, of urgency. And in a prison in Colorado, Michael Lee Jones sat with something else entirely. Something without coffee and without quiet and without peace. Something that would last for the rest of whatever years he had remaining. And that was, if not enough, then at least this. The end of the moving. The end of the cities and the events and the venues and the hotel lobbies and the suitcases. The end. There are things that happen in the margins of cases like this that are never fully told. The things that do not make it into the official documentation or the media coverage or the courtroom record. The conversations that happen in hospital corridors and police break rooms and the parking lots of baseball stadiums in Frederick, Maryland. The moments between the major plot points where the actual texture of the investigation lives. Let me try to capture some of that texture, because it matters to the full understanding of what this case was. Foote, in the weeks after the DNA result came back and Jones was arrested, went back through his notes from the meeting in Frederick. He read his own observations, his own assessment that Jones had seemed innocent. He read the words he had written in the moment, words that reflected genuine belief that they had the wrong man. And he held those words against the certainty that the DNA had produced and thought about what the distance between them meant. It meant that Jones was extraordinarily good at presenting himself. That was the conclusion Foote reached, and it was the right conclusion. But it also prompted Foote to ask himself a question that he thought about for a long time afterward. Not whether he should have seen through Jones in that meeting. He could not have seen through a man that practiced, not in that context, not without the DNA already in hand. But whether there was something he should have done differently in how the meeting was conducted. Whether the structure of the conversation had, in some way, allowed Jones to deploy what he was good at in a way that a different structure might not have. This is the kind of reflective self-examination that good investigators do. Not flagellation, not excessive self-criticism, but the honest assessment of whether different choices would have produced better information. Foote's conclusion was that the meeting had been conducted professionally and appropriately, and that Jones's ability to present as innocent was not something that could have been neutralized in that setting without something Jones had explicitly denied they would have, the DNA. but he carried the lesson forward. The lesson about the particular kind of person who is genuinely dangerous precisely because they do not look dangerous. The person who has learned, either through calculation or through some darker form of instinct, to wear the appearance of harmlessness like a garment. He thought about how many people, over the years, had interacted with Jones and felt exactly what Foote had felt in that stadium. That sense of relief, that lowering of the natural alertness that large, powerful strangers produce. That comfortable assessment that this person is fine, that this person is safe, that there is nothing here to worry about. And then he thought about what those people had gone on to experience. It was the thought that police and investigators carry but rarely articulate publicly, because it is the kind of thought that can produce the wrong kind of fear if transmitted without care. Not the actionable, reasonable, protective awareness that is useful, but the paralyzing, ambient terror of understanding that the world contains people who are expert at appearing trustworthy and use that expertise as a weapon. The world does contain those people. This is true, but the response to that truth is not to stop trusting anyone. The response is the one that Brennan and Foote and the prosecutors and the laboratory technicians and the Cody's analysts had all, in their various ways, modeled. The response is to look carefully, to not accept the first impression when the stakes are high enough to warrant looking again, to build systems that can detect the patterns that individual encounters cannot see, to remain, even when someone seems fine, alert enough to check. This is a quiet kind of courage, not the dramatic courage of confronting danger head-on, but the sustained, unglamorous courage of maintaining attention in the face of everything that tells you to relax. The courage of the second look when the first look has told you there is nothing to see. Brennan had that courage in abundance. And in a world full of cases that go cold because the first look did not find anything and the second look was never taken, that abundance is rarer than it should be. Let me also try to describe what the case felt like from the perspective of the people working it who were not the lead investigators. The hotel staff who were interviewed. The employees of Centerplate and its counterparts who fielded strange questions from a private investigator about a large worker with glasses. The laboratory technicians who processed the DNA samples. The analysts who run queries through Cody's and see the results appear on their screens and understand what those results mean before anyone else does. These are people who do specialized work within a much larger system. People whose contribution is specific and technical rather than narrative. The hotel security guard who had been on duty the night in question was interviewed multiple times over the course of the investigation. He had been present. He had not seen anything suspicious. He had been doing his job, which at 5:28 in the morning involves maintaining alertness against the fatigue of the night shift while monitoring spaces that are, in the normal course of things, unoccupied and quiet. He had not seen Jones crossing the lobby with the suitcase in any way that registered as a concern. In retrospect, that was the design of it. Jones had moved at the pace of a man doing something ordinary. He had not hurried. He had not looked furtive. He had simply moved, as people in hotel lobbies in the early morning hours move, with the quiet purposefulness of someone who knows where they are going and is going there. The guard had seen a large man with a suitcase. His brain had filed it correctly under hotel guest with luggage and moved on. That was not a failure. That was the human brain doing what human brains do, making rapid categorizations based on available information, operating on the assumption that what things look like is what they are. Jones had understood this assumption and had exploited it. What Brennan had done, sitting in his investigative mode in front of a monitor, was override that assumption. He had looked at the same image not with the automatic categorization of a mind that expected to see what it was seeing, but with the specific question, is there something in this footage that does not fit the category it appears to belong to? And there was. The weight. The resistance of the suitcase against the threshold. The return without the bag. The hour. Those details did not fit hotel guest with luggage when examined in combination. They fit something else. They fit the theory that everyone had laughed at. And that is the thing that makes this case matter as a story beyond its specific facts. It matters because it demonstrates the difference between looking and seeing, between the automatic processing of information and the deliberate, question-driven examination of it, between expecting and checking. In the practice of everyday life, automatic processing is essential. The human brain cannot subject every input to deliberate examination. It would be paralyzed by the cognitive load. So it categorizes and moves on. And in most cases that works well enough, because in most cases what things look like is what they are. But in the practice of investigation, particularly in the investigation of cases where a predator has deliberately shaped his behavior to exploit automatic processing, the deliberate examination is the tool that nothing else can replace. You have to look at the suitcase wheel. You have to look at it knowing that it probably means nothing. You have to look at it anyway. Because if it does mean something, and you have not looked, then the man with the suitcase walks out to his car and drives away, and the case stays cold, and the next city comes, and the next event, and the next victim. And if you have looked, then something else happens. The thing that happened here. And if you have found in this story something that stays with you, some image or idea or moment that lands differently than the others, I hope it is that. Not the villain's story, not the investigator's story, not even the survivor's story, though all of those are real and all of them matter. But the wheel, the tiny, ordinary, almost invisible moment of resistance. The detail that told the truth when everything else was designed to lie. Look for the wheels. They are there, in more places than you might think. And it matters that someone notices them. This is the part of the story where we bring everything together and ask the question that this case ultimately poses to anyone willing to sit with it. Not the question of who did it, because we know that. Not the question of whether justice was served, because we know that too. Imperfectly and incompletely, but in the genuine and documented sense that a guilty man is behind bars and the crimes he was convicted of have a name and a verdict attached to them. The question this case poses is more uncomfortable than either of those. The question is about the cases we do not know about the versions of this story where no one slowed down, where the woman in the grass did not survive, or survived but never reported, or reported and was not believed. About the versions of this story where the hotel did not have cameras, or the cameras did not capture the relevant corridor, or the hotel did not face a lawsuit and therefore never hired someone to look at the footage again. About the versions of this story where there was no Ken Brennan. Those versions exist. Statistically, empirically, in the documented reality of how violence is committed and investigated and resolved, those versions exist. They exist in the cold case files of police departments in cities across the country. They exist in the unspoken experiences of people who have never told anyone what happened to them. They exist in the Cody's database in the form of crime scene profiles that have not yet been matched to a perpetrator. They are not hypothetical. The acknowledgement of their existence is not pessimism. It is honesty. And honesty is what allows us to ask the right question, which is not just, how did this case get solved, but what would it take to solve more of the ones that have not been solved? Brennan's answer, offered modestly and with the typical deflection of someone who does not want to be held up as a model, was essentially this. More people need to look harder, not look at all. Most investigators look. They review the evidence that is available. They follow the leads that seem most promising. They apply the available resources to the cases that come before them, and they work, most of them, with genuine commitment to the idea that the truth is worth finding. But looking harder, in the specific way that he looked, requires something that is difficult to institutionalize without the right conditions. It requires the space and the time and the specific focus that his retainer had provided in this case. It requires the freedom to form a theory that sounds absurd and hold it against the weight of professional skepticism because the evidence supports it. It requires the willingness to watch 17 times what everyone else has already watched twice. Most investigative environments do not reliably produce those conditions. They produce efficiency. They produce prioritization. They produce, often, genuine competence in the investigation of the cases that can be solved in the time available and with the resources at hand. But they do not always produce the specific, obsessive, second-look quality that found Jones. Brennan was honest about the fact that this was a structural problem rather than a personal one. He did not think the detectives who had cold cases were bad detectives. He thought they were detectives in systems that had not given them what the Airport Regency Hotel's insurance company had given him. Time. Specificity. The single question in the single case. The luxury of looking harder. This observation should prompt, in anyone thinking seriously about it, a question about how that luxury might be extended. Not to every case, because no system has the resources to pursue every case with the intensity of a dedicated private investigator, but to more cases. to the cases where the evidence suggests that a second look might produce what the first look did not, to the cases where pattern evidence suggests that a mobile predator might be connecting dots across jurisdictions in ways that no single investigative team can see. There are models for this: task forces, cold case units, dedicated analysts whose job is specifically to look for the patterns that individual cases do not reveal. These structures exist in some jurisdictions and not others, and where they exist, they produce results that are consistent with what the Jones case demonstrated. Patterns can be found when someone is specifically tasked with looking for them. The question of whether those structures are adequately resourced and adequately prioritized is a policy question that exceeds the scope of one case in one hotel in one city. But the Jones case is a demonstration of what happens when the answer to that question is yes. Even the limited, litigation-driven version of yes that produced Ken Brennan's retainer. The DNA evidence in this case was collected and processed and entered into Cody's. The matches were returned. The connection was made. And the connection, ultimately, led to a conviction that addressed not just one crime, but at least three, with the strong suggestion that the full scope of Jones's crimes was larger than that. That is the best-case scenario of how the system is supposed to work. Evidence collected, entered, matched, connected, investigated, prosecuted, convicted. Each step doing what it is designed to do. The case is therefore both an example of the system working and an example of how many things had to go right, how many individual decisions and resources and contingencies had to align for the system to work in this particular instance. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and holding both of them is the only honest way to understand what this case means. It is a victory, a real, documented, legally established, humanly important victory. 3 cases closed. A predator convicted. A sentence imposed. Victims provided with something they had been without for years. And it is a window into a category of problem that is far larger than this single case. A problem that the victory does not solve, that the conviction does not resolve, that will persist beyond the sentence and the courtroom and the verdict into the ongoing reality of violence that is committed in plain sight, disguised as the ordinary, protected by the expectations of others who are not quite looking hard enough. Both things, simultaneously. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that true crime is not, at its best, about entertainment. It is about honesty, about looking at the things that happen in the world without the protective softening of disbelief or the comfortable distance of it could not happen here. About understanding the mechanisms of violence and the mechanisms of response to violence and the gap between them, and asking what that gap means and what, if anything, can be done about it. This case is one of the clearest illustrations of that gap that any single investigation has produced. And Brennan's contribution to that illustration was not the solving of the case, though he did solve it. His contribution was the refusal to look away from the gap itself. The refusal to accept that a woman found in a field 8 miles from where she had been sleeping had simply vanished from a locked building, and that was all anyone could say about it. He had said more. He had kept saying it until the evidence said it with him. And then the evidence said what it said, and a courtroom listened, and 12 people reached a conclusion, and a verdict was delivered, and a sentence was handed down, and the gap, at least in this instance and for these victims, was bridged. That is what happened. And it started with a wheel. And it started with a man who looked at a wheel and decided it meant something. And it started with a woman who survived. All 3 things. All of them necessary. None of them guaranteed. The next time you watch a security camera in a lobby somewhere, or a footage clip on the news, or any of the thousands of small visual records that modern life produces and mostly discards, remember this case. Remember that the image contains what it contains regardless of whether anyone pays attention to it. Remember that attention is the thing that turns a recording into evidence, and evidence into a name, and a name into a verdict, and a verdict into something that matters to a real person who needed it to matter. Remember that someone has to look. And then remember that you are someone. And that looking is a choice. We are at the end now. And the end of a story like this deserves to be given its full weight, not rushed past in a hurry to get to the conclusion, but allowed to settle in the way that things settle when they are true and when they cost something. Let me tell you what Brennan said when someone asked him, years later, what he thought about when he thought about the Jones case. He said he thought about the hour, not the verdict, not the arrest, Not the DNA result, or the mercury marine shirt, or the moment the suitcase will caught on the threshold. He thought about the hour. The hour between 3:44 in the morning, when Anastasia's keycard log recorded her entering her room, and 5:28 in the morning, when Jones emerged from the elevator with the suitcase. 1 hour and 44 minutes. The time that is not captured on any camera, that exists only in what the evidence implies, and what the DNA confirms, and what no recording will ever reconstruct with the specificity that would make it truly knowable. He said he thought about what that hour meant, not in the forensic, evidentiary sense, but in the human sense. The hour in which a young woman's life was being changed in ways it would never fully recover from. In a room on the 4th floor of a hotel near an airport, while the rest of Miami went about the business of its night. The city outside was doing whatever cities do at 4 in the morning, the restaurants closing and the clubs winding down, and the early workers beginning their shifts and the night sky beginning, somewhere far out over the water, to think about the possibility of dawn. And in a room on the 4th floor, the hour. He said he thought about it because it was the thing the investigation could not reach. The thing that all the footage and all the DNA and all the patients and all the phone calls and all the work had circled around without quite touching. The hour itself. The thing that was done in it. The person who lived through it. Anastasia had been to the courtrooms and through the legal processes and had experienced whatever she experienced in those settings. She had survived the investigation as well as the crime, which is its own kind of endurance. She had done what she had done, asked for what she had asked for, fought in the way she had available to fight. And whatever that had produced for her, whatever outcome the civil proceedings had led to, was hers. But Brennan's mind returned to the hour, because the hour was real in a way that verdicts are not. Verdicts are constructed. They are the product of arguments and evidence and the deliberation of people who were not there. They are important. They are meaningful. They are the mechanism by which the community says we have heard what was said and we have decided what it means, and this is the consequence. But the hour was not constructed. It simply was. It happened in that room, and it was done to a real person, and that reality does not change with the verdict. It is as real after the verdict as it was before it, because the past is fixed in a way that the future is not. Brennan thought about the hour because he believed the hour was the part of the case that should not be forgotten. That the story of the investigation and the suitcase and the mercury marine shirt and the DNA was the story of the response to the hour. And responses can be celebrated when they succeed, but they should not be celebrated in a way that allows the original event to be replaced by the story of what was done about it. The hour was not the investigation. The investigation was the consequence of the hour, and the hour was what it was. He said he thought about it because he thought it was important to remember the order of things. To remember what everything else was in service of. To remember that a woman had been hurt, and that the hurt was real, and that it preceded everything else, and could not be undone by anything that came after it. He said he was glad he had looked. He was glad he had found the wheel. He was glad Jones was in prison. And he was glad the 3 victims whose cases had been linked knew what had happened and who had done it, and that it was over. But he thought about the hour. That is where Ken Brennan left the story when he told it honestly. Not at the verdict. Not at the arrest, not at the moment of insight in front of the monitor. At the hour, at the thing that started all of it, and that nothing that came after could fully address. And that is the honest ending of this story too. Not the triumphant resolution, not the satisfying click of justice delivered, though both of those things are real and worth acknowledging. But the acknowledgement, underneath all of it, of what the case was actually about. A young woman from Ukraine had come to America to build something. She had taken a job on a cruise ship because the job was there and the money was needed in the sea and the travel had a kind of promise to them. She had injured her hand and been put up in a hotel near an airport while she healed, a liminal place, a waiting place, the kind of hotel room where life is on pause while it figures out where it is going next. And in that pause, in the middle of a night that should have been nothing more than a night's sleep, something had been done to her that she had not consented to and had not deserved, and that had changed her life in ways she had not asked for, and had not earned, and had not done anything to bring upon herself. That is the story, not the investigation, not the suitcase, not the mercury marine shirt, not even the wheel. Her, a 21-year-old woman, alone in a foreign country, trying to do the thing she had come there to do, and encountering something that all the systems designed to protect her had not, in that specific hour, managed to prevent. And then all the rest of it. The utility worker who slowed down. The hospital that saved her life. The lawyer she asked for. The detectives who worked the case. The footage that existed. The private investigator who watched it 17 times. The phone calls and the subpoenas and the Frederick, Maryland baseball stadium. The DNA. The Cody's matches. The trial and the verdict and the sentence. All of it in service of the simple and enormous fact that a human being had been harmed and deserved to have it taken seriously. She deserved to have it taken seriously. And Ken Brennan, obsessive and unglamorous and slightly annoying to hotel lawyers, had taken it seriously. That is the whole of it. That is what happened. And what it means, what you take from it and carry with you after this is over, is yours to decide. But if you take nothing else, take this. Someone has to look. Someone has to refuse to let the cold case stay cold. Someone has to watch the footage again. Because somewhere in the footage, in more cases than have been solved, there is a wheel. And a wheel is everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of why these cases matter, of why the women at the center of them matter, then please leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me what you think. Because this community, every single person who watches and comments and shares and subscribes, is the reason this kind of storytelling can continue. You are what keeps this channel going, and your presence in this space matters to me. If you have not yet subscribed, please do it now. It costs you nothing, and it means that stories like this one continue to reach people who need to hear them. And if this video moved you, if you think someone else should hear this story, share it with them. Because true crime is not entertainment at its best. It is a conversation about the world we live in and what we are willing to pay attention to. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being willing to sit with difficult things and to take them seriously. The case of the vanishing blonde is closed now. Michael Lee Jones is in prison. The wheel has spoken. And somewhere, a 21-year-old woman who survived a night that should have killed her is living the rest of her life. We do not know her full story. We do not know where she is, or what she is building, or what the years since have given her, and what they have taken. We do not need to know. That part of the story belongs to her. But we know this. She survived. And that survival changed everything. Good night, everyone. Stay safe, stay alert, and I will see you next time.